Hey you. Yes, you. The one who thought being filthy rich would solve literally everything. Tonight we're pulling back the velvet curtain on the Gilded Age, that glittering, outrageously extra era of American history where fortunes were so massive they stopped making sense, and the women sitting on top of those fortunes were somehow the most trapped people in the room. We are talking mansions with 60 rooms and 0 exits. We are talking diamond necklaces that weighed more than the marriages they came with. We are talking women who had everything the world said they should want, and lost it all anyway, in the most spectacular, heartbreaking ways imaginable. This is not a story about bad luck. This is a story about a system that handed certain women a golden key and forgot to tell them the door only locked from the outside. Drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you watching from? What time is it there? Because wherever you are, dim those lights, get comfortable, and stay close. This one does not get lighter as it goes. There is a particular kind of loneliness that only exists inside very large houses. Not the ordinary loneliness of an empty apartment or a quiet Sunday afternoon, but something stranger and harder to name. The loneliness of standing in a gilded hallway so long and so wide that your own footsteps echo back at you like a question nobody's going to answer. The Gilded Age built a lot of those hallways, hundreds of them in fact. Marble floors, vaulted ceilings, paintings worth more than most American families would earn in a lifetime. And at the end of those hallways, more often than anyone at the time cared to admit, stood a child who had absolutely no idea what to do with any of it. This is where the real story begins. Not with the spectacular marriages or the legendary jewels or the newspaper headlines that followed these women like particularly aggressive dogs. It begins earlier, in nurseries and drawing rooms and summer estates, in the specific and quietly devastating experience of growing up wealthy, visible, and profoundly alone. Because almost every woman whose life eventually became a cautionary tale of the Gilded Age carried something underneath all that silken inheritance, a wound carefully hidden that no amount of money ever managed to heal. And in an era that had absolutely no language for childhood trauma, no framework for understanding what it does to a person, no professional you could discreetly visit on a Tuesday afternoon, those wounds had nowhere to go. So they went inward, and they stayed there, and they grew. The first thing you have to understand about wealth in the Gilded Age is that it was not, in any modern sense of the word, warm. We tend to romanticize that era through the soft lens of costume dramas and historical fiction, imagining candlelit dinners and witty conversation, and mothers in rustling gowns tucking children into four-poster beds. The reality was considerably more institutional. Upper-class children in late 19th century America were raised almost entirely by hired staff, nurses, governesses, tutors, housekeepers, while their parents occupied a separate social universe that might as well have been a different continent. Physical affection was considered vaguely undignified. Emotional expressiveness was a sign of poor breeding. Children were expected to be clean, quiet, and appropriately decorative, which, when you think about it, is not so different from how the same families treated their furniture. This was simply the accepted architecture of wealthy family life, and most people living inside it did not experience it as deprivation because they had no other reference point. You cannot miss what you have never seen. But the absence of warmth leaves marks regardless of whether you can identify it, and the children of the Gilded Age accumulated those marks quietly, behind closed nursery doors, in houses that were spectacular in every way except the ones that actually matter to a small person trying to make sense of the world. Now add to this baseline emotional austerity the particular chaos that money and status tend to attract, the scandals, the social catastrophes, the spectacular marital disasters of ambitious people living at extremely close quarters with extremely high stakes, and you start to understand why so many of these children arrived at adulthood carrying invisible luggage that would take decades to unpack, if it ever got unpacked at all. Take the circumstances surrounding Cecily Ashworth, born in 1882 into one of New York's most aggressively social families. Her father, Edmund Ashworth, had made his fortune in railroad speculation with the particular ruthlessness that the Gilded Age seemed to produce almost industrially. Her mother, Vivian, was a celebrated beauty who had married Edmund for reasons that were purely financial and made approximately zero effort to conceal this fact, even from her own children. Theirs was not a household where love was spoken about, because love, in that particular social context, was considered something between a personal weakness and a naive fairy tale. You married for position, you stayed married for appearances, You conducted whatever private arrangements seemed necessary for your own survival, and you did not discuss it at dinner. Cecily grew up watching this negotiation play out in real time. She watched her mother perform warmth for guests and withdraw it the moment the drawing room emptied. She watched her father work 18-hour days to accumulate money that none of them seemed to enjoy, and then spend his evenings in quiet fury at the social ambitions his wealth was supposed to satisfy, but somehow never quite did. She watched the servants who raised her come and go, replace the moment they showed any sign of forming an actual attachment to the children in their care, because attachment in that household was considered a professional liability. The message being transmitted, whether anyone intended it or not, was straightforward. People leave, warmth is performance, and the only reliable constant is the house itself. What strikes modern observers about these childhoods is how comprehensively the emotional needs of children were simply not on the agenda. This was not malice, at least not usually. It was the operating assumption of an entire class, reinforced by etiquette manuals and social custom, and the sincere belief that discipline and material provision were the full extent of parental obligation. If you fed, clothed, educated, and eventually married off your children, you had discharged your duty completely. That they might need something else, something softer, less quantifiable, more genuinely human, was a thought that simply did not occur to most parents of that generation, and if it did occur, there was no particular framework for acting on it. The governesses who spent the most time with these children were in an impossible position, and most of them knew it. They were paid to instruct, to correct, and to maintain order. They were not paid to love, and in most households showing anything resembling maternal feeling toward their charges would have been considered overstepping. The better ones found small ways around this. An extra story at bedtime, a particular patience with a child's questions, the kind of quiet consistency that passes for warmth when nothing warmer is available. The worst ones were simply efficient. Either way, the relationship ended the moment the child was old enough for school, or when the family moved, or when a newer, more expensive governess became fashionable. And the child who had quietly attached to that particular presence would sit very still for a day or two, and then fold the experience into the growing collection of absences they were learning to carry without showing. Cecily Ashworth, to return to her specifically, got her first real lesson in impermanence at age 7, when her family's financial situation shifted dramatically after a series of railroad investments collapsed. The collapse was not ruinous. The Ashworths remained wealthy by any reasonable standard, but it was sufficient to require significant household economies, which in practice meant that the entire staff was replaced with a cheaper one. For Cecily, this meant losing the only adult who had shown her consistent, unperformed kindness in the first decade of her life. For her parents, this was a personnel adjustment. The gap between these two experiences of the same event is, in many ways, the entire Gilded Age in miniature. What happened next to the Ashworth family belongs to that genre of upper-class social catastrophe that the period seemed to generate with remarkable frequency. Edmund, under the pressure of financial anxiety and the particular social humiliation that comes with perceived failure in a world that respects nothing else, began spending less time at home and more time in the company of people who were either helping him recover his position or helping him forget that he needed to. Vivian, who had never been sentimental about her marriage and was not about to start now, responded by escalating her own social commitments to a level that left almost no room for anything else, including her children. The household ran on clockwork precision and emotional vacancy. Dinners were attended, appearances were maintained, and Cecily, now 8, 9, 10 years old, learned to be very small and very quiet in a very large house. This particular pattern, wealthy parents disappearing into their own crises while children receded into the margins of the household, was common enough in the Gilded Age that it barely registered as unusual. When your neighbours are doing the same thing, when the etiquette manuals actively encourage the separation of children from adult social life, when the entire structure of upper-class existence is designed around the idea that servants handle children and parents handle society, you stop noticing that anything is wrong. The children noticed, of course. Children always do. But they learned very quickly that noticing was not useful, and that expressing it was worse. The psychological architecture this built was durable. Girls who grew up in these households learned to perform contentment with impressive fluency. They learned to read rooms, to anticipate what adults needed from them, to present the correct version of themselves in each social context. They learned that love was conditional and that the conditions changed without notice. They learned that the safest strategy was to need as little as possible from other people, because need was a vulnerability and vulnerability had consequences. And then they grew up and tried to form intimate relationships with these lessons running quietly in the background, and were generally surprised by how badly it went. The Gilded Age was producing in vast quantities women who were exquisitely trained to be ornamental and completely untrained to be emotionally present, either to themselves or to anyone else. This was not considered a problem, because the system did not require them to be emotionally present. It required them to be beautiful, well-connected, and socially effective, and for those purposes, the training worked perfectly. It is only when you look at what happened to these women in the privacy of their actual lives that the costs become visible. Vivian Ashworth, incidentally, did not emerge from her own marriage unscathed. She had grown up in similar circumstances, her father a banker of considerable influence and minimal warmth, her mother a woman who had turned social performance into something approaching an art form and devoted approximately the same emotional energy to her children that she devoted to selecting wallpaper. Vivian had learned from this example with great thoroughness. She was charming, she was elegant, she was ruthlessly competent at the business of upper-class social life. And she was, in any interior sense of the word, profoundly lonely. This she would never have admitted, because admission required a language she had never been taught, and also because loneliness was considered a personal failing, evidence that you had not managed your life correctly. Here is one of the great recurring ironies of Gilded Age biography. The women who were most damaged by emotional deprivation in childhood grew up to replicate almost exactly the conditions that had damaged them, usually while being entirely convinced they were doing better than their own parents had. Vivian Ashworth genuinely believed she was a good mother. She provided for her children materially. She ensured they were educated, dressed correctly, and introduced to the right people. She did not shout or rage or make scenes. By the standards of her own upbringing, this was motherhood at a high level. That her daughter was growing up in the same emotional desert she had occupied, herself was simply not visible to her. Because that desert was her entire frame of reference for what normal life looked like. The particular tragedy of these intergenerational patterns is that they are rarely the result of malice. The Gilded Age produced very few genuinely evil parents, and very many simply absent ones. Absent not physically, most of the time, but emotionally, in that specific way that wealthy families specializing in social performance tend to produce. The children of these households grew up technically loved, in the sense that their parents would have insisted quite sincerely that they loved them. But love without the capacity to express or receive it is a somewhat theoretical comfort, and a child who has never experienced warmth as a physical reality, rather than an abstract claim, grows up with a very particular kind of hunger. That hunger had consequences. It shaped how these women moved through the world as adults, what they sought, what they tolerated, how they interpreted the behavior of the people around them. Women who grew up in Gilded Age households, raised by paid staff and emotionally inaccessible parents, tended to fall into recognizable patterns as adults. Some sought constant external validation from society, from the press, from a succession of relationships, to compensate for the approval they had learned early not to expect from home. Some attached themselves to people and things with an intensity that puzzled observers who did not know the context. Some swung between extravagant social performance and complete withdrawal, oscillating between the two modes they had been raised to inhabit. Some simply kept very still and waited for things to end, which is its own kind of strategy. The Gilded Age, being entirely uninterested in any of this psychological complexity, described these women using the vocabulary it had available: difficult, unstable, eccentric, ungrateful. The idea that someone might be behaving strangely because of what happened to them as a child was not yet part of the cultural operating system. Childhood was considered a largely irrelevant period that sensible adults left behind, and emotional difficulty in grown women was attributed to constitution, to weakness of character, or to the general unpredictability of the female temperament, which male observers of the period discussed with the confident authority of people who have absolutely no idea what they are talking about. There is something almost comedic about the Gilded Age's relationship with emotional health, in that dark way where you laugh, because the alternative is despair. The richest country in the world, in its richest decade, and the official medical response to a wealthy woman exhibiting signs of acute psychological distress was usually one of three things: send her abroad for a rest cure, confine her to a sanitarium, or get her married to someone appropriate, which would presumably solve the problem through unclear mechanisms. None of these options addressed the actual source of the difficulty. All of them, in various ways, made it considerably worse. But they were tidy, they were socially acceptable, and they allowed everyone around the affected woman to feel that something useful had been done, which was more or less the point. The rest cure deserves particular mention here because it reached peak fashion in exactly the decades we are discussing, and it represents perhaps the most elegant possible example of the era's habit of disguising inaction as treatment. Developed with the best of intentions by the physician Silas Weir Mitchell in the 1870s, it prescribed complete bed rest, sometimes for months, combined with isolation from any mentally stimulating activity, including reading, writing, or conversation. The underlying theory was that the nervous systems of women required rest from the strains of modern life. In practice, it meant taking women who were already suffering from isolation and emotional deprivation and adding more isolation and more deprivation at significant expense. The patients who were sent to these establishments often emerged worse than they had entered, which their doctors attributed to the severity of the original condition rather than to anything the rest cure itself might have contributed. This was, even by the medical standards of the time, a fairly impressive piece of circular reasoning. What the women in question needed, and this is so obvious from a distance of 150 years that it barely requires stating, was not rest. They needed to be heard. They needed relationships in which honesty was possible. They needed the freedom to have interior lives that differed from their performed exterior ones. They needed, at the most fundamental level, to matter to someone, not because of their social position or their beauty or their wealth, but simply as people. These are not exotic requirements. They are the basic conditions for a livable human existence. And the Gilded Age, for all its extraordinary wealth, was spectacularly bad at providing them. The children who became the tragic figures of the era were, in almost every case, children who had started their lives without those conditions, not deprived of food or shelter or education, but deprived of something less visible and in the long run more essential: the experience of being fully seen and genuinely loved by someone who was not being paid to be there. Everything that came later, the marriages, the scandals, the breakdowns, the spectacular reversals of fortune, can be read, at least in part, as variations on this original theme. The hunger that was not fed in the nursery had to go somewhere, and in adult life it went everywhere. Cecily Ashworth, who had grown into a genuinely striking young woman with excellent manners and a finely calibrated social intelligence, entered her debutante season at 18 with all the advantages money could provide, and the particular disadvantage of having never experienced a relationship that did not require her to perform. She was celebrated, admired, discussed favourably in exactly the social columns that mattered. She handled all of this with a composure that impressed everyone who observed it, and concealed, with great skill, the fact that she found the whole exercise slightly surreal. Being admired by people who did not know you, she had discovered, was not actually that different from not being known at all. It was just louder. She would marry, as the daughters of the Gilded Age were expected to marry, with considerable ceremony and careful negotiation of terms, and the marriage would unfold, as so many of these marriages unfolded, according to a logic that had very little to do with the emotional needs of the people inside it. But that is a story for a later chapter. What matters here, at the beginning, is this: she arrived at that marriage carrying everything her childhood had given her: the composure, the social fluency, the ability to read a room at 40 paces, and also everything her childhood had failed to give her. And the second category was longer than the first. The Gilded Age built extraordinary things. It built palaces that still stand today, railroad networks that transformed a continent, fortunes that funded universities and museums and concert halls that millions of people enjoy without knowing their origin. It also built, in somewhat less celebrated fashion, an extraordinary number of emotionally uninhabitable childhoods. The palaces got the headlines, the childhoods got the consequences, and the women who grew up in them spent the rest of their lives living with a paradox that the era itself never managed to perceive, let alone resolve: that you can be surrounded by everything and still be, in the ways that matter most, profoundly without. This is the wound that runs beneath all the stories we're about to tell. Not the diamonds, not the divorces, not the newspaper scandals, though we will get to all of those, do not worry. The wound is older than any of that, and quieter, and it was made in houses that had every possible luxury except the one thing that would have made any difference. The children grew up anyway, as children do. They put on their best faces and their best clothes, and they went out into the world that had been prepared for them, carrying their invisible luggage with a poise that would have been genuinely admirable if anyone had understood what it cost. They learned to seem whole when they were not, to seem certain when they were lost, to seem loved when they were performing love because they had never seen the real thing up close long enough to know what it looked like. And the Gilded Age, which was excellent at surfaces and poor at depths, looked at all that polished composure and saw exactly what it wanted to see. Perfect women, perfectly arranged. In perfect houses, it did not look closer. It rarely did. What happened when those surfaces cracked is what we will spend the rest of this story examining. But you need to understand the foundation before you can understand the collapse. And the foundation, in every single case, was this: a child in a large and beautiful house, learning very early that the world was not going to meet her halfway, and deciding, with the particular determination of the young, to meet it all the way herself instead. That decision was brave. It was also the beginning of everything that followed. There is another dimension to these childhoods that tends to get overlooked, and that is the role of spectacle. The Gilded Age was nothing if not theatrical, and the children of its most prominent families grew up not merely in wealthy households, but in households that were themselves a kind of public performance. The estates, the entertaining, the elaborate social rituals, all of it was designed to be seen, to communicate something specific about the family's position, to make an argument to the world about who these people were and what they deserved. Children were part of this argument. They were produced at appropriate moments, in appropriate costumes, to demonstrate the family's prosperity and good taste, and then return to their quarters to continue not existing in any inconvenient way. The effect of growing up as a prop in your own family's social theatre was something that the era did not examine, and that the children themselves could rarely articulate at the time. But it did something specific to how they understood their own identity. If you are regularly presented to the world as an emblem of wealth, of social success, of your family's aspirations, you begin, without necessarily deciding to experience yourself through that lens. You become less certain about who you are when no one is watching. You become more fluent in the performed version of yourself than in whatever lies beneath it. And you become, over time, genuinely confused about whether there is a beneath it, because you have never really been given the space to find out. This is a sophisticated psychological problem, and we should probably acknowledge that it sounds almost impossibly abstract next to the concrete miseries of actual poverty. The hunger, the cold, the grinding insecurity that most Americans of that era lived with daily. Nobody in the Gilded Age nursery was starving. Nobody was cold. Nobody was going to be evicted. The suffering of wealthy children is a category of suffering that is easy to dismiss, and in some moods, easy to find faintly comic. All that money, and somehow still miserable. What exactly was the problem? The problem, boringly, was the same as it always is, that human beings require certain things to develop properly, and those things are not reliably provided by marble floors and unlimited domestic staff. You can understand this and simultaneously understand that it is a much nicer problem to have than genuine destitution, and still conclude that it was a real problem with real consequences. The Gilded Age produced its particular variety of damaged women not through deprivation in the ordinary sense, but through a very specific and systematic failure to provide the invisible necessities, the attention, the warmth, the experience of being genuinely important to someone, that are, as it turns out, rather essential. The girls who grew up in these conditions developed, as people do when they are managing unmet needs, a range of coping strategies. Some became extraordinarily accomplished, brilliant students, skilled musicians, well-read beyond anything their social circle required, pouring into intellectual achievement the energy that had nowhere else to go. Some became extraordinarily social, building elaborate networks of acquaintance that filled the calendar and the drawing room without ever quite filling the lonelier spaces. Some developed a kind of radical self-sufficiency, deciding early that dependence was dangerous and independence was the only reliable option. This last strategy looked most like strength from the outside and was, on the inside, often the most heartbreaking, because the woman who has decided she does not need anyone is the woman who has decided in advance to go without. The marriages these women entered were inevitably shaped by these strategies. A woman who had learned that warmth was performance would tend to select a partner on the basis of criteria other than warmth: social position, financial security, family name, the simple fact of being asked when you had not expected to be. A woman who had constructed her identity entirely around external achievement would find herself profoundly destabilized by a marriage that removed her from the sphere of public accomplishment and deposited her in the domestic sphere, which offered a quite different and much less legible set of metrics. A woman who had committed to radical self-sufficiency would find intimacy alarming in a way she could not explain to anyone, including herself. None of these difficulties were understood as the products of specific histories. They were understood by the era that produced them, as personality, as the fixed and unchosen characteristics of particular women who were variously cold, difficult, unstable, or simply strange. The idea that a woman might be cold because she'd been raised in emotional refrigeration was not part of the analysis. The idea that she might be unstable because stability had been systematically denied her was not considered. What was considered was whether her behavior was appropriate, and when it was not, what might be done to correct it. Correction, in the Gilded Age, took forms that deserve at least brief examination, because they illuminate so clearly what the era thought was actually wrong with these women. The rest cure has already appeared in these pages, but it was hardly alone. There was also the marriage cure, which rested on the theory that a difficult young woman simply needed the stabilizing influence of a husband and a household of her own. A theory that worked out with middling success at best and occasionally catastrophic results, given that the men selected for this stabilizing function were often chosen by parents whose primary criterion was social compatibility, rather than anything more particular to the woman in question. There was the European tour, dispatched with great optimism as a kind of emotional reset, which at least had the advantage of being genuinely interesting, even if it did not address whatever was actually wrong. There was the country house, the change of air, the course of treatment at whichever fashionable spa was currently considered most restorative. None of these things were useless. Some of them even helped, in temporary and superficial ways. None of them went anywhere near the root. The root was always the same. It was in the nursery, in the long corridors, in the rooms where children waited for adults who were busy with something more important. It was in the first lesson every Gilded Age daughter of consequence learned, which was that she had value to the people around her, in direct proportion to what she could provide. Beauty, social connections, a good marriage, reflected glory, and that value contingent on performance is not actually the same thing as love, though it can look remarkably similar under certain lighting conditions. She learned this lesson early, and she learned it thoroughly, and she carried it forward into an adulthood that would test it in every possible way. The Gilded Age built spectacular stages for this testing. It provided extraordinary costumes and extraordinary props, and an audience of genuinely impressive size. What it could not provide, for all its staggering material resources, was a script that acknowledged what these women actually were. Not symbols, not ornaments, not social functions in human form, but people, complex and hungry and trying, in the ways available to them, to build lives that felt like something. They did not always succeed. The conditions were not designed for success in that particular sense, but they tried, and the trying itself, the sheer human insistence on meaning even in the middle of a system that did not have room for it, is worth paying attention to. It is worth more, arguably, than the jewels and the mansions and the newspaper headlines that are usually what we remember. Those things are dramatic. This is true. But drama, in the end, is just what happens on the surface. The real story is underneath, where the child stood in the long corridor and listened to the echo of her own footsteps, and understood without words that she was going to have to figure most of this out by herself. She was usually right about that, and she usually did figure it out, or something that passed for figuring it out, or at least something she could present to the world as figuring it out. The Gilded Age was nothing if not accommodating when it came to well-dressed pretense. It had built its entire civilization on the principle that appearance and reality were essentially interchangeable, which was convenient because it meant that a woman who had learned to perform happiness was, for most social purposes, functionally identical to a woman who had actually achieved it. Whether she experienced any difference, in the privacy of those large and well-appointed rooms, is the question we will keep returning to. The answer, predictably, is yes. She did experience a difference. She experienced it with great intensity on a daily basis. in a silence that the era around her was very well practiced at maintaining. And sometimes, eventually, that silence broke. When it did, the results were dramatic enough to make the newspapers, which is why we are here telling these stories, rather than the thousands of others that ended quietly and left no visible mark. The women who made it into history are, in some sense, the ones whose silence broke loudest. That is the dark mathematics of historical memory. What survives is what was visible, and what was visible was usually a crisis. But behind every visible crisis was a much longer story, beginning in a childhood, in a house where the hallways were beautiful and the warmth was scarce, and a small person was learning to live on less than she needed. That is the foundation. Everything else we are going to examine, the marriages and the scandals and the heartbreaking late chapters of these lives, is built on top of it. And now that you can see the foundation clearly, nothing that gets built on it is going to surprise you, because the logic, once you understand it, is perfectly consistent. The Gilded Age set up these women to need things the world around them could not provide, and then watched with a mixture of fascination and bewilderment as they spent their lives trying and failing to close the gap. It called them tragic. It called them eccentric. It called them difficult. It never once called them what they actually were, children of a particular system, doing exactly what that system had trained them to do, in circumstances that system had created, reaching for something the system had never bothered to include. So we have established, with some thoroughness, what these women were made of before the world got hold of them. Now it is time to look at what the world actually did with them. And for that, we need to introduce 3 specific figures, not because they are the only stories worth telling, but because their lives laid side by side form something more useful than individual biography. They form a pattern, and patterns, once you can see them, are very difficult to unsee. The 3 women are Marietta Holloway, Caroline Fisk, and Dorothea Price. They lived in overlapping but distinct decades. Their social circles occasionally intersected, though they moved in slightly different orbits. Their financial situations varied. One inherited, one married, one spent. But all 3 arrived at considerable wealth at some point in their lives, and all 3 departed from it in ways that made the newspapers and raised eyebrows and generated the kind of sustained public commentary that passes, in the Gilded Age, for cultural analysis. Their specific circumstances are different enough to make comparison interesting. Their underlying trajectories are similar enough to make comparison disturbing. Marietta Holloway was the earliest. Born in 1868 into a Boston family of the kind that had been respectable for long enough that respectability itself had become a sort of family profession, she was considered, by the time she was 19, one of the most accomplished young women in New England social circles. Not primarily for her beauty, though she was attractive enough by the era's measurements, for her intelligence. She read extensively, spoke 3 languages with genuine fluency rather than the decorative fluency that society required, and had opinions about things that women of her class were not particularly expected to have opinions about, which she expressed with a directness that some people found refreshing and others found alarming, depending almost entirely on whether they were the target. She was, in the parlance of her moment, a great deal. Which is to say, she was a lot of woman for the social structures of 1880s Boston to know what to do with, and those structures responded in the way institutions usually respond to things they cannot categorize. They attempted to contain her, with varying and eventually disastrous success. Caroline Fisk arrived a decade later, and in a different key entirely. Where Marietta was intellectual and angular, Caroline was intuitive and warm, the sort of person who remembered every name at every party, and made each guest feel, for the duration of their conversation, that they were the most interesting person in the room. She grew up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a shipping merchant who had done very well, and a mother who had done even better at converting that wealth into social position. Caroline's upbringing was, in some ways, less emotionally barren than the model we examined in the previous chapter, simply because her mother was a woman of genuine social gifts, who applied some portion of those gifts to her own household, not just to her entertaining. Caroline was consequently more naturally warm than many of her contemporaries, more comfortable with genuine feeling, and also, this is the part that matters, more vulnerable to having that warmth systematically exploited by people who recognized it as a resource. Dorothea Price was the youngest of the 3, born in 1884, and she came from new money in the way that the Gilded Age both celebrated and subtly penalized. Her father, a self-made man from Ohio whose specific industry was sufficiently unglamorous that it rarely appeared in polite biographical sketches, had accumulated a fortune of staggering size by the time Dorothea was a teenager, and had then proceeded to spend the rest of his life trying to translate it into the kind of social position that the older families treated as a birthright. He mostly failed, as first-generation Gilded Age wealth mostly failed at this particular project, though he came close enough to make the attempt interesting. Dorothea inherited both his fortune and his ambition, without quite inheriting his pragmatism, which turned out to matter more than anyone expected. 3 women, 3 starting points, 3 sets of advantages and 3 sets of invisible liabilities, all acquired in the circumstances that the previous chapter described. Now watch what happens next. Marietta Holloway, at 22, was at the absolute peak of her social ascent. She had been presented, had been admired, had been written about in terms that managed to be simultaneously flattering and slightly warning in nature, the way that certain reviewers write about artists they find too confident, impressed, but defensive. She had received offers of marriage, several of them, from men who were appropriate in every measurable way, and she had turned them down with a frankness that scandalized her mother, and privately delighted at least 3 of the rejected suitors, who found her honesty bracing even when it was pointed directly at them. She was, in short, doing extremely well by her own standards and somewhat less well by the standards of the world she was required to inhabit, and then she fell in love. This is, in Gilded Age biography, rarely a development that improves things, and in Marietta's case it was no exception. The object of her attachment was a man of no particular social standing and considerable personal charisma, an artist who had come to Boston for a commission, and stayed because he found the social landscape interesting in the way that people find train wrecks interesting, compellingly arranged and moving toward a conclusion. He was talented, as it happens, in the specific way that makes talent simultaneously attractive and dangerous, genuinely brilliant at his work, genuinely indifferent to the social requirements his life imposed on the people around him. Marietta, who had spent her entire young life performing propriety she did not particularly feel, found this indifference magnificent. Her family found it catastrophic. What followed was the predictable collision between a woman who had developed her own strong sense of what she wanted, and a social system that had very fixed ideas about what she was supposed to want, and it resolved in the way these collisions tended to resolve in the 1890s, in favour of the system, at considerable personal cost to the woman. The relationship was terminated by a combination of family pressure and financial leverage. Her inheritance was of the conditional variety, as many Gilded Age inheritances strategically were, and Marietta was dispatched on a European tour that was meant to function as an emotional reset, and functioned, instead, as an extended education in the specific melancholy of being far from home without being free. She came back. She made an appropriate marriage eventually to a man whose primary quality was that he was appropriate. She was 26, and already the most interesting parts of her life, by her own later accounting, were behind her. The marriage was not actively bad. It was, which is its own category of difficult to endure, simply small. Small in ambition, small in feeling, small in the space it allowed for any version of Marietta that resembled the one she had privately preferred. She managed it with the competence she had been trained to deploy, and she was, by all visible measures, perfectly fine. She was also, by any interior measure, quietly going out like a candle in a closed room, which is a process that takes a long time and leaves very little visible trace until it is complete. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, Carolyn Fisk was constructing what looked, from any reasonable external vantage point, like an excellent life. She had married well, a man named Theodore Fisk, from a family of the kind that had been in the right pew at the right church for enough generations to make their social position essentially geological. Theodore was not unkind. He was also not particularly present, in the emotional sense of the word, preferring the company of his club and his business affairs to anything that might require sustained attention to another person's inner life. This was not unusual. This was, in fact, the standard arrangement. Carolyn, being constitutionally generous, interpreted it charitably. He was busy, he was tired, he showed his care through provision rather than presence, all of which was true, and none of which filled the specific gap she felt with increasing clarity as the years progressed. What Caroline had in excess was warmth, and the need to deploy it somewhere. Theodore's indifference left that warmth with nowhere useful to go, so she deployed it outward, into an extraordinarily active social life, a wide circle of acquaintances who genuinely loved her company, and a series of charitable commitments that occupied the parts of her calendar that entertaining did not. She was busy in the way that people are busy when they are trying not to notice something. She was beloved in the way that people are beloved when they give generously and ask for little in return, which is almost always because they have learned that asking tends to produce disappointment. Dorothea Price, the youngest of our three, had a rather different beginning to her adult chapter, because she entered the Gilded Age social scene at a moment, around 1902, when the rules were beginning, very slightly, to shift. The absolute rigidity of the 1880s had softened by a degree or two. New money was not entirely accepted, but it was less aggressively rejected. Women of her class were beginning to have access to slightly more conversation, slightly more travel, slightly more public presence than Marietta's generation had been permitted. Dorothea interpreted this marginal expansion of permission as rather more freedom than it actually represented, which was the optimistic era of her generation, and she proceeded accordingly, loudly, expensively, and with a confidence that delighted some observers and deeply alarmed others. She was, to put it plainly, a great deal of fun. She entertained on a scale that would have been considered excessive even by Gilded Age standards, which is saying something, given that those standards included things like dinner parties with live swans. She collected art with genuine taste and considerable recklessness. She travelled to places that women of her position did not typically go, in the company of people that women of her position did not typically keep. And she wrote about all of it in letters that circulated among her friends with something approaching the velocity of early journalism. She was, in the vocabulary of her moment, colourful, which is usually how history books describe people who are doing exactly what they want in ways the surrounding culture is not entirely comfortable with. What nobody quite noticed, behind all the colour and the noise and the spectacular entertaining, was that Dorothea Price was managing an internal experience of considerable desolation. The extravagance was not, as it might appear, the expression of someone who had too much and had run out of ways to spend it. It was the activity of someone who had discovered that the internal silence became louder when everything around her was quiet, and had responded by making absolutely certain that everything around her was never quiet. This is a coping strategy that works quite well in the short term and has some notable limitations in the long term, beginning with the fact that it is extraordinarily expensive. Now look at these three trajectories together, and something becomes visible that is not visible when you look at each one separately. Marietta was contained by the system directly, through family pressure, through financial leverage, through the explicit enforcement of social norms. Her collapse was slow and internal, the kind of thing that left no dramatic newspaper headline, just the gradual attenuation of a person who had been required to make herself smaller than she was for too long. Caroline was contained more softly, through the simple absence of anyone who required her to be more than competent and charming, until she had largely forgotten that she had ever expected more than that. And Dorothea was not contained at all in the obvious ways. She had more money and slightly more freedom than the other two, but she had managed, through the sheer force of her spending and her entertaining and her perpetual motion, to contain herself, which is arguably the more efficient mechanism. The system did not need to exert equal force on all three. It had different tools for different women, calibrated to the specific vulnerabilities that each presented. For a woman like Marietta, direct pressure worked because her primary leverage, her inheritance, was subject to family control. For a woman like Caroline, the more insidious tool of emotional neglect was sufficient, because she had been raised to require very little and to feel guilty about requiring that. For a woman like Dorothea, who was too wealthy to be easily pressured and too independent to be quietly neglected, the system relied on something more subtle, the simple fact that the life available to her, even at its most expansive, was still not quite large enough for who she was. And the gap between her and the life she was permitted to inhabit produced, over time, a kind of internal pressure that she dealt with in the only ways she had available. This is the mosaic. 3 different women, 3 different mechanisms, 3 different timelines, and yet arriving at essentially the same destination, a life that looked, from the appropriate distance, like success, and felt from the inside like a very well-appointed version of insufficient. This is also the point at which we need to turn our attention to the specific and frankly remarkable phenomenon of the Gilded Age's relationship with female beauty, because it operates as a kind of pressure multiplier in all 3 of these stories, and it deserves its own examination before we proceed. The beauty standard of the Gilded Age was, like most things in that era, simultaneously specific and completely insane. The ideal woman was tall but not imposingly so, fair but with some colour, slender but curved in the approved locations, which were precisely defined and subject to modification by the various engineering projects that the era's fashion industry inflicted on the female body. The corset was still in universal use for most of this period, which is a fact that modern audiences tend to receive with mild horror, and the Gilded Age itself received as entirely normal, because when everyone around you is doing something, it ceases to register as remarkable. Good luck breathing freely or eating a full meal, but your silhouette will be mathematically correct, which was apparently the priority. Beyond the silhouette, the specifics of facial beauty were documented, debated, and disputed with an intensity that would be recognizable to anyone who has spent time on social media in the 21st century. The primary difference being that the Gilded Age conducted this conversation in print rather than online, which meant the feedback loop was slightly slower, but no less relentless. Society pages described women's appearances in terms that range from reverent to clinical, cataloguing features with the detached assessment of an auctioneer describing a particularly interesting item. Noses received particular attention, which seems strange until you understand that the nose was considered, by the aesthetic theory of the period, to be the central organising feature of the face, the element around which all other elements arrange themselves in harmony or discord. This is relevant because the particular form of self-destruction that Marietta Holloway's real-world counterpart, and we will use her actual historical parallel here, briefly, before returning to our composite figures, had to navigate was precisely the obsession with a specific facial feature that the era had elevated to near mythological status. The desire to achieve what contemporary beauty writing called the Greek profile, a straight line from forehead to nose, inherited notionally from classical sculpture, was powerful enough to motivate women to take medical risks that modern practitioners would find difficult to contemplate with equanimity. The specific intervention that became fashionable in the first decade of the 20th century was the injection of paraffin wax under the skin of the nose, designed to smooth bumps and alter the bridge's angle in ways that brought it closer to the sculptural ideal. This procedure was, to be clear, performed without the safety infrastructure that modern cosmetic procedures require, by practitioners whose understanding of how the human body responds to foreign substances over time was incomplete in ways that would soon become very apparent. The paraffin, injected with the confident optimism of the era, had a tendency to migrate. Slowly, unpredictably, and eventually quite visibly, the material would shift away from its intended location and settle elsewhere, producing effects that were the precise opposite of the aesthetic improvement it had been meant to achieve. Women who had undergone this procedure in their 20s would find, by their 40s, that their faces had reorganized themselves around the migrated wax in ways that no artist would have designed and no patient had anticipated. The physical change was, in many cases, severe enough to constitute what we would now call disfigurement, and it was irreversible. The medical understanding to correct it did not exist. What had been a voluntary intervention aimed at achieving a beauty standard had become a permanent alteration that removed the woman in question from the very social currency she had been trying to increase. There is something almost perfectly allegorical about this outcome. The pursuit of the beauty ideal, taken to its logical extreme, destroyed the beauty it was meant to enhance. The standard devoured its own adherent. And the era, which had created the standard and promoted the procedure and celebrated the ideal, watched the results with the discomfort it was not quite equipped to process as guilt. Because to process it as guilt would have required acknowledging the role the standard itself had played. It would have required admitting that a beauty norm so powerful it motivated women to undergo experimental medical procedures was not simply a preference, but a pressure, and that pressure of that intensity has consequences for the people subjected to it. This was, in 1910 or thereabouts, not a framing that was easily available. The more comfortable interpretation was that the women who had undergone these procedures had made a choice, and the consequences of that choice were their own, which is technically accurate in the narrow sense and deeply incomplete in the broader one, because choices do not happen in vacuums, and choices made under the kind of social pressure the Gilded Age brought to bear on female appearance were never entirely free. Marietta Holloway did not undergo the paraffin procedure. Her particular form of self-modification was less dramatic and more durable. The daily, decades-long project of making herself presentable according to a standard she found exhausting, in a life she had not entirely chosen, with a face she was expected to maintain in the precise degree of attractiveness that society required, which was considerable but not excessive, because excess was its own kind of violation. Caroline Fisk's relationship with the beauty standard was different again. She was beautiful in the way that warm people often are, not because of specific features, but because of what happened to her face when she was engaged and interested, which was often. This kind of beauty is actually quite difficult for the Gilded Age to know what to do with, because it does not photograph well and cannot be adequately described in the society page's usual vocabulary of measurements and colours. It is also, frustratingly, the kind of beauty that does not age in the expected direction, because it depends on presence rather than surface. Caroline at 40 was more beautiful in any meaningful sense than Caroline at 20, which the Gilded Age found baffling and slightly beside the point. Dorothea Price, who had inherited her father's determination along with his money, attacked the beauty question with the same comprehensive energy she brought to everything else. She was dressed magnificently, always. She was coiffed with a precision that suggested considerable investment in the project. She wore her jewellery with the confidence of someone who has decided that if you're going to be looked at, and she was going to be looked at, that was simply a given. You might as well control the terms of the looking, and she did. For a long time, she absolutely did. The moment she stopped being able to control those terms, through age and changing fashion, and the particular way that the Gilded Age disposed of women who had passed their moment of maximum social utility, was the moment her particular variety of unravelling began. All three of these trajectories, different as they are in their specifics, share a common engine, the conversion of a person into a symbol. Marietta became a symbol of appropriate New England womanhood and was gradually consumed by the performance. Caroline became a symbol of Gilded Age social grace and was quietly hollowed out by the work of maintaining it. Dorothea became a symbol of new money's determined self-reinvention and was eventually undone by the gap between the symbol and the person it was meant to represent. The Gilded Age was extraordinarily good at making symbols. It had the resources, the social infrastructure, the press apparatus, and the appetite for spectacle that symbol-making requires. What it was considerably less good at was acknowledging that the symbols were also people, with interior lives that did not always cooperate with the narrative requirements of their symbolic function. When those interior lives became impossible to ignore, when the symbol cracked and the person showed through in ways that were inconvenient, the era tended to respond with a mixture of fascination and judgment that was not, ultimately, very useful to anyone involved. The cracks, when they came, were spectacular enough. But before we get to the cracks, we need to spend some time with the moment of maximum elevation, the period when each of these women was at the absolute pinnacle of what the Gilded Age had to offer, when everything the system promised appeared to have been delivered, when the world looked at them and saw exactly what it wanted to see, and rewarded that vision lavishly and without reservation. Because those moments existed, they were real, and they mattered, not because they make the subsequent fall more dramatic, though they do, but because they tell us something important about what the Gilded Age was actually offering its most celebrated women. What was in the package when the package was finally opened? What did it actually contain, this thing that so many people wanted so badly, and that these women, more than most, actually received? The answer is more complicated than the packaging suggested. The packaging was extraordinary, well, we need to be honest about this. These were lives of genuine privilege, genuine access, genuine experience. The art, the travel, the conversation, the cultural engagement, the sheer sensory richness of existing at the top of the most extravagant society the continent had yet produced. None of this was nothing. To say that these women suffered in ways that made their lives not worth living would be both inaccurate and disrespectful. They experienced real beauty, real pleasure, real accomplishment. They moved through the world in ways that most of their contemporaries could only imagine, and at the same time the thing that was missing with a consistency and a depth that none of the surface richness could quite compensate for. What was missing, in case you need a plain statement of it, was the freedom to be themselves in full, to exist as complete people rather than as the portion of themselves that the Gilded Age found useful, attractive, and socially appropriate. The portion that was required to remain hidden was different for each of them. For Marietta it was her intellectual ambition and her emotional life. For Caroline it was her need to be genuinely known rather than pleasantly encountered. For Dorothea it was the quiet self underneath all the extravagance, the one that had been there since childhood and had never been introduced to anyone. This is why the mosaic matters. You can look at any one of these lives individually and see a story about an individual woman with individual choices and individual circumstances. But when you lay all three side by side, what you see is a system, consistent in its methods, consistent in its targets, consistent in its outcomes, operating with the smooth efficiency of something that has been doing this for a very long time. The Gilded Age did not need to be consciously malevolent to produce these results. It simply needed to be exactly what it was. A society organised around the principle that women's value was conditional, that the conditions were externally defined, and that the consequences of failing to meet them were significant. The women who lived inside this system were not stupid. They were, in many cases, brilliantly perceptive. They understood at some level what was being done to them. They simply lacked the vocabulary to name it clearly, the social support to refuse it effectively, and in most cases the economic independence to exit it without losing everything else along with it. So they did what people do when they are intelligent and trapped. They found the available degrees of freedom and used them as fully as they could, and they performed compliance in the areas where compliance was the price of survival, and they tried to build, in the interstices of the life they were required to inhabit, something that felt like a life they had actually chosen. Sometimes it worked, partially for a while. Sometimes it did not work at all, and the gap between performance and reality became so large that it could no longer be managed. What happened in those moments is what we'll spend the next chapters examining in detail, because the details are where the real story is, and the real story is far more interesting than the headline version that the Gilded Age produced, and that history has mostly preserved. The headline version is, "These women were tragic." The real version is, "These women were trapped inside a system that required them to be symbols and then penalised them for being human." There is a difference, and the difference matters, because tragedy implies inevitability and fate, while what actually happened was neither inevitable nor random. It was the predictable output of a specific set of social arrangements that had specific effects on specific people in specific circumstances. The Gilded Age arranged those circumstances with considerable care and considerable expense, and absolutely no irony. It produced its tragedies with the same meticulous attention to surface detail that it brought to its architecture and its entertaining, beautifully organised, impressively scaled, and ultimately in service of something that the people inside it were only beginning, very slowly, to question. 3 women, 1 pattern. And enough of the story still ahead to understand properly how a system this comprehensive manages to make even its most spectacular failures look, from the right distance, like individual misfortune. The physical dimension of all of this deserves more than passing attention, because the Gilded Age was profoundly, almost obsessively, physical in its relationship with female identity. The body was not a private matter, it was a social document, read constantly and commented on freely, a site where class aspirations and moral judgments and aesthetic preferences all converged and expressed themselves in the kind of detail that modern audiences tend to find astonishing. Not because we no longer scrutinise women's bodies, which would be optimistic to the point of delusion, but because we tend to do it with slightly more awareness that we are doing it, which is at least a marginal improvement. In the Gilded Age, the scrutiny was systematic and openly acknowledged. Society pages published descriptions of women's appearance at public events with a thoroughness that went well beyond what any ordinary reader needed in order to picture the scene. The colour of a gown, the arrangement of the hair, the number and quality of jewels, the precise degree of slenderness or its pleasing alternative, all of it was documented compared with previous appearances and evaluated against the standard of the moment, which shifted just enough over the years to ensure that compliance was a moving target requiring constant attention. Good luck relaxing, because the standard was updated regularly, and the previous season's version had already been quietly deprecated. For women like Marietta, who had a complicated relationship with the entire performance to begin with, this scrutiny was an ongoing low-grade torment. Every public appearance was a test with visible metrics, administered before an audience that was simultaneously enthusiastic and unforgiving. A successful appearance generated the pleasant but faintly hollow reward of being described favourably. An unsuccessful one generated the considerably less pleasant experience of being described in the careful, slightly regretful language that the society press used when it wanted to note that something was wrong without explicitly saying so. Phrases like, "not quite at her best," or perhaps a little fatigued, that functioned as coded criticism in a social language everyone read fluently, and nobody ever fully acknowledged. This is the language that shapes a person, over time, in ways that are not immediately visible. You do not receive one comment and collapse. You receive 1,000 comments, across 2 decades, delivered in a register of mild observation that makes direct objection almost impossible, and you absorb them, and they accumulate, and they become part of the background noise of your own internal monologue, the quiet, constant commentary that eventually starts to sound less like other people and more like your own thoughts. This is how societies shape the people inside them, not through dramatic declarations, but through the patient, relentless repetition of small signals that add up to a very large message. The message, received by all 3 of our women in their respective keys, was consistent. You are acceptable as long as you continue to be what we need you to be, and the moment you cease to be that, we will let you know. And the way we will let you know is that the room will become slightly colder in ways nobody will explicitly acknowledge, and you will have to figure out on your own what you did and how to correct it, on the understanding that the criteria for correction are flexible and largely unspoken. This is not, by any reasonable standard, a humane system. It was, by the standards of its own moment, simply Tuesday. What is remarkable, looking back at these lives from a considerable distance, is not that the system eventually broke the people inside it. That part is, given everything, fairly predictable. What is remarkable is how long the people inside it held on, how much competence and intelligence and sheer human resilience went into managing lives that required daily the performance of a self that was not quite real in a setting that was not quite safe. Marietta Holloway managed it for decades before the accumulation became unmanageable. Caroline Fisk managed it until she ran out of the energy that warmth requires to sustain itself when nothing is warming you in return. Dorothea Price managed it with more noise and extravagance than either of the others, which perhaps bought her more time or perhaps simply made the ending louder. All 3 managed it longer than anyone, including themselves, had the right to expect. That is worth saying plainly before we proceed to the parts of their stories that history found more interesting, the part where the management stopped working. Because the collapse, dramatic and often public and always painful, was not the whole story. The long, skilled, largely invisible labour of the years before, it was also part of the story. It just happened to be the part that left no headline. There is a particular kind of strength that looks like nothing from the outside. It looks like a woman in an excellent gown at an excellent party, making excellent conversation, leaving before anything gets complicated. It looks like competence. It looks like composure. It looks, from every available external angle, like a woman who has everything under control, which is exactly what it is meant to look like, and exactly why it costs as much as it does. The women of the Gilded Age were extraordinarily well trained in this specific performance, and they maintained it under conditions that modern observers, with the benefit of hindsight and a few decades of psychological vocabulary, can recognize as actively hostile to human flourishing. They maintained it because they had to, because the alternative, letting the composure slip, allowing the gap between performance and reality to become visible, had consequences they had learned to take seriously. Social ruin in the Gilded Age was not a metaphor. It was a specific and practical outcome, with specific and practical effects on a woman's ability to live the life she was depending on. The stakes were real, and the women managing them knew the stakes better than anyone, because they were the ones who would pay them. So they held on, and they held on. And the holding on was, in its own way, an achievement, even if the era that required it was too busy watching for the fall to notice the extraordinary effort that preceded it. We are watching now, and we can see both things at once, the effort and the fall, the competence and the cost, the life that was performed and the life that was lived underneath it. We can see, with the clarity that distance provides, that these 3 women, and the dozens more they represent, were not primarily cautionary tales. They were people doing their considerable best in circumstances that were not of their choosing and not of their making, shaped by forces they could feel but rarely fully name. Aimed at destinations that kept moving just as they thought they had arrived. The destination question is where we go next. What, exactly, was Marietta Holloway reaching for in the years after her first great disappointment? What kept Caroline Fisk going through the long middle of a marriage that offered security without intimacy? And what was Dorothea Price actually looking for underneath all that spectacular and ultimately unsustainable expenditure? The answers are less dramatic than you might expect. They are also, in their quiet way, considerably more heartbreaking. The question we left hanging at the end of the last chapter, what were these women actually reaching for, turns out to have a specific and somewhat startling answer in at least one case. Because while Marietta Holloway was managing her slow interior erosion, and Carolyn Fisk was deploying her warmth into the social ether, and Dorothea Price was spending her way through the silence, there was another category of Gilded Age woman entirely, the one who decided with complete clarity and considerable early age exactly what she wanted, and proceeded to pursue it with a strategic patience that would have impressed a chess grandmaster. Her name, for our purposes, is Sylvia Wentworth Cross. She was 13 years old when she first read the newspaper account of a great aristocratic wedding, the kind of transatlantic alliance that the Gilded Age conducted with some regularity, wherein an American fortune crossed the ocean to prop up a European title in a transaction that both parties generally understood to be commercial, while both parties simultaneously insisted was romantic. The groom was a duke. Not a minor duke, not a duke of the second tier, but a genuinely significant one, with an estate of sufficient historical grandeur to appear in every guidebook, and a family lineage that could be traced back to people who had done things that were still, centuries later, considered impressive. The bride was an American heiress whose family had made their money in ways that were modern and unglamorous and extremely effective. Sylvia read about this wedding in the kind of detail that society journalism provided. The gown, the guests, the gifts, the sheer overwhelming scale of the thing. And then she did something that most 13-year-olds do not do. She put down the newspaper, picked up her diary, and wrote the following, or something closely approximating it. If I had been born 5 years earlier, this would be a different story. Then she thought about it for a moment and added, I am not 5 years earlier, but I am here now, and marriages, she had already observed from the useful vantage point of a child who pays attention to adult behaviour, are not permanent. This is, objectively, a remarkable thing for a child of 13 to think. It is also, when you understand the context in which Sylvia Wentworth Cross had grown up, entirely logical. She had been raised, as we have already established for this entire category of Gilded Age daughter, in a household where relationships were understood primarily as arrangements, where social position was the operative currency, and where the gap between what was felt and what was performed was wide enough to drive a very well-appointed carriage through. She had watched her parents navigate their own marriage as a business partnership with domestic logistics, and she had drawn from this the not entirely unreasonable conclusion that marriage was, at its core, a strategic transaction, and that the only relevant question was whether you were conducting the transaction on your own terms or someone else's. Most women of her class conducted it on someone else's terms. They were presented, evaluated, selected, and settled. The initiative, such as it was, belonged almost entirely to the other side of the negotiation. Sylvia, at 13, had already decided she found this arrangement aesthetically unappealing and practically inefficient, and she had begun, with the methodical clarity that would become her most defining characteristic, to think about how to reverse it. What followed was one of the most sustained and deliberately constructed social campaigns in the history of an era that was not exactly short on deliberate social campaigns. Over the next several years, Sylvia Wentworth Cross educated herself with a specificity that went well beyond what her formal education required. She read history, not the decorative history that society young ladies were expected to absorb, but actual political and social history, with particular attention to the European aristocratic systems that produced the kind of men she was interested in. She studied languages, French with real seriousness, German adequately, Italian with genuine pleasure, because the social world she was aiming at required them, and because she found, to her own slight surprise, that she genuinely liked them. She read art and architecture, learned to talk about both with authority, and discovered along the way that the great English country estates were not merely social venues, but layered historical documents, and that a woman who could discuss them intelligently with their inhabitants had an advantage over one who merely admired the curtains. She was, in short, preparing, and the preparation was remarkable not only for its thoroughness, but for its patience. Sylvia was not in a hurry. She understood, with a strategic clarity unusual in someone still in their teens, that the most effective approach to a long-term objective was not speed but positioning, and that positioning required time and deliberate placement, and the willingness to take indirect routes that moved you steadily toward the destination without advertising the destination to anyone who might complicate the journey. The specific indirect route she chose was friendship. Not strategic friendship in the cynical sense. though it was certainly calculated, but genuine friendship, or as genuine as anything can be when it is also at some level deliberate. She cultivated a relationship with the wife of the man she had decided to marry, and this is the detail that tends to make modern audiences stop and reconsider everything they thought they understood about this story, because it is genuinely strange. She befriended the incumbent. She became close with the woman who occupied the position she intended eventually to occupy. She was a guest in the house she intended eventually to own, and she maintained this position with extraordinary composure for years. Let us be clear about what this required. It required Sylvia to be consistently charming and genuinely pleasant to a woman she was, in some fundamental sense, waiting to replace. It required her to be a frequent and welcome presence in a household whose domestic arrangements she was already, privately, cataloguing with an eye toward future modification. It required her to maintain, in every interaction with the Duke himself, a register that was warm but not forward, interesting but not threatening, memorable without being alarming, the precise social calibration of a woman who wants to be noticed as a possibility without being perceived as a threat. This is an extraordinarily difficult performance to sustain, and it requires a very specific set of social skills that Sylvia had spent years developing specifically for this purpose. She was, by every account available, very good at it. The friendship with the Duchess was not entirely calculated, and here is where the story becomes more complicated than a simple tale of strategic manipulation. Sylvia was not without genuine warmth. She had enough of it to make the relationship real on her side, even while it was also instrumental. The Duchess, for her part, genuinely liked Sylvia. She found her engaging, intelligent, a refreshing contrast to the more conventional social figures who populated her husband's world. This was, of course, precisely what Sylvia intended her to find, but intention does not always preclude authenticity, and the friendship they built was real enough, in its way, to make what came afterward complicated for everyone involved. The marriage she was waiting to disintegrate did so eventually, as the marriages of the era's transatlantic alliances tended to do, because they were built on foundations that had more to do with financial necessity and social ambition than with anything the participants actually felt for each other, and foundations of that kind have a limited structural life. The dissolution was not dramatic in the violent sense. These things rarely were, because the social cost of visible drama was prohibitive, and both parties understood it. It was more like a slow withdrawal, a gradual formalization of the distance that had been there almost from the beginning, until eventually the distance became official and the newspapers got to write about it. Sylvia was, at this point, in her late 20s. She had been patient for 15 years. She had positioned herself with extraordinary care and maintained that position through circumstances that would have defeated a less determined person. She had wanted this specific thing for more than half her conscious life, and now the obstacle was removed, the field was open, and the next chapter could begin. It did not begin immediately, because even Sylvia understood that there was a pace appropriate to these transitions, and that visibly moving from friendship with the departed wife to courtship with the available husband in too compressed a time frame would generate the kind of commentary that would be damaging to everyone involved. She waited what she calculated to be a sufficient period. This is the kind of thing she actually calculated, which should give you a sense of the organizational rigor she brought to her personal life. And then she allowed the relationship to develop at a pace that appeared organic, even though essentially nothing about it was. The courtship, when it happened, was oddly brief given the elaborate prelude. He had known her for years, after all. She had made herself thoroughly known to him without ever having appeared to do so. The groundwork was so completely laid that the actual structure went up with remarkable speed. They were engaged, and then they were married, and then Sylvia Wentworth Cross became the wife of the man she'd decided at 13 she was going to marry, and the story arrived at the destination that had been its target for so long. And here is where it gets interesting in a way that nobody who has been following the strategic brilliance of the campaign could entirely have predicted. Because the arrival at the destination was, it turned out, somewhat different from the destination as imagined. The estate was real, the title was real, the social position was real, and it was as substantial as she had expected it to be, and in certain public contexts, the official occasions, the formal entertaining, the specific ceremonial functions that came with her new role. It was genuinely impressive, and she genuinely valued it. She was good at it. She was perhaps better suited to this particular role than almost anyone else of her generation, because she had spent so long preparing for it that she knew every requirement before she was required to meet it. But a house that you have admired from the outside for 15 years is not quite the same house once you're living in it. The estate that had functioned in her imagination as a symbol of everything she was working toward turned out to be, in practice, a place with drafts and staff disagreements and administrative demands, and a husband who was a fully realized human being with opinions and habits and moods, rather than the somewhat abstract figure who had occupied the duke-shaped space in her long-term planning. He was not unkind, he was also not simple, and simplicity had been, she realized with some surprise, what 15 years of fantasy had quietly substituted for complexity. The life of an English aristocratic estate in the early 20th century was, it should be said, not exactly the leisured paradise that its social reputation suggested. It was a small feudal economy, with the owner at the administrative centre of it, responsible for the management of a substantial staff, a significant agricultural operation, a historic building that required constant expensive attention, a web of tenant relationships, social obligations that expanded in every direction, and the particular demands of maintaining a position that was, by the time Sylvia arrived to occupy it, beginning to feel the early pressure of an era that was not going to be as kind to inherited aristocratic structures as previous eras had been. The money that had seemed inexhaustible from the outside was, from the inside, a subject of ongoing and occasionally anxious negotiation between what the estate required and what it produced, a gap that Sylvia's own resources, she was not without money of her own, helped to bridge but did not eliminate. None of this was what she had planned for, because none of it had been visible from the vantage point of a 13-year-old reading a wedding announcement and deciding to make the world rearrange itself in a specific way. The wedding announcement had contained the duke, the estate, and the title. It had not contained the drain on the roof, or the disagreement about how to modernize the tenant cottages, or the particular social obligations of a position that required her to be present and appropriate in ways and contexts that she found, after a few years, considerably more demanding than energizing. There is something almost cosmically ironic about the most meticulously planned romantic campaign in the social history of the Gilded Age, arriving at a marriage that was, in its daily texture, as administratively complex and emotionally ambiguous as most of the less carefully arranged ones. Sylvia had planned for 15 years to achieve this life, and the life she achieved was real and substantial, and not without its genuine rewards, and also significantly more complicated than the plan had anticipated. The plan, it turned out, had been a map drawn without certain key features of the terrain, because those features are not visible from where you stand when you're 13, and determined and haven't yet learned that the gap between a symbol and a reality is always wider than it looks. The photographs from the early years of her marriage show a woman who is poised, beautifully dressed, clearly performing the role with considerable skill, and whose expression, on closer examination, is the expression of someone working rather than resting. There is a particular quality of effort in it, visible only because we know what to look for, that distinguishes it from the unguarded happiness of someone who has simply ended up somewhere they genuinely wanted to be. Sylvia had ended up exactly where she had aimed. She had simply not known, until she arrived, that aiming and arriving are two fundamentally different experiences. The psychological literature on goal achievement, none of which existed in 1921 naturally, so nobody could have handed Sylvia a pamphlet on the subject, has a great deal to say about the experience of attaining a major long-term objective. It is, reliably and across a wide range of contexts, more disorienting than anticipated. When you have organized your identity around the pursuit of something for long enough, the achieving of it leaves a structural gap that the thing itself, however good it is, cannot quite fill. The pursuit was the architecture of the self. The attainment is just the furniture. And furniture, however fine, is not the same as a house. Sylvia had spent 15 years being the woman who was going to achieve this thing. The achievement arrived, and suddenly she needed to be the woman who had achieved it, and that was a rather different proposition. The purpose that had organized her days, her choices, her social positioning, her intellectual development, all of it had been pointing at this specific destination, and now that she was here, the pointing finger had nothing left to point at, which is an unexpectedly vertiginous experience for someone whose inner life had been so thoroughly organized around forward motion. She did not collapse. Let us be clear about that, because the story is not one of spectacular breakdown in the manner of some of the other women we are examining. Sylvia Wentworth-Cross was too competent and too self-disciplined for the obvious kind of unravelling. What happened instead was slower and less dramatic, and in some ways more permanent, a gradual withdrawal from the investment she had made in the role she had worked so hard to occupy. Not an abandonment. She continued to perform the role with admirable professionalism, but a kind of interior recession. A retreating of the self from engagement with a life that turned out to be less of a destination and more of a maintenance project. The Duke, for his part, was not entirely unaware of this. He was not, as she had somewhat expected during the years of fantasy, a man who was going to be fundamentally transformed by the right woman's arrival. He was himself, consistently and without much apology, a person shaped by his own history and his own emotional architecture, and the space where her arrival had been supposed to change, everything turned out to contain, instead, simply another human being navigating his own complicated relationship with an inherited life that imposed its own heavy requirements. They were, in some ways, well matched, both organised, both capable, both possessed of the specific competence that managing a large and demanding historical estate requires. In other ways, they were two people who had arrived at the same address from different directions and were still, years in, working out what they were to each other beyond their respective functions in the household they maintained together. This is not, to be clear, a description of a terrible marriage. It is a description of a real one, which in some circumstances is effectively the same thing, and in others is considerably better than the alternative. Sylvia's marriage was real in the way that most long-lasting marriages of that era and class were real. It was functional, it was occasionally warm, it was built on mutual competence and shared responsibility, and it had, in its texture, considerably more of the practical and considerably less of the romantic than 15 years of focused anticipation had suggested. What makes her story particularly resonant, in the context of the larger narrative we are building here, is not the marriage itself, but what preceded it. The campaign she ran, the extraordinary, patient, methodical 15-year project of positioning herself for a specific outcome, represents one of the most complete examples available of what happens when the intelligence and drive that the Gilded Age systematically excluded from the professional and intellectual sphere is redirected entirely into the social and matrimonial one. Sylvia Wentworth-Cross was, by any reasonable measure, a strategically brilliant person. In another era, that strategic brilliance might have gone into law or medicine or business or politics, or any number of fields where its exercise would have produced outcomes visible to the world and satisfying to the person doing it. In her era, the only arena where that kind of sustained, complex, long-horizon strategic thinking was available to a woman of her class was the marriage market. So that is where it went, and it worked, in the sense that it achieved its objective. It simply achieved an objective that turned out to be somewhat different from what the planning had specified. There is a version of this story that presents Sylvia as a villain, the calculating woman who manipulated her way into someone else's position, who befriended a wife in order to replace her, who treated human relationships as instruments of a personal agenda. That version is not entirely without basis, but it is incomplete in a way that matters, because it ignores the context in which those choices were made. A world that offered women of her intelligence and capability exactly one arena of meaningful agency, and then judged them for using it with the same efficiency they might have applied to anything else. She was strategic because the only available game required strategy. She was patient because impatience was not a viable option. She was calculating because the uncalculating version of her life would have led somewhere she could not afford to go. The system had made the rules, and she had played by them better than almost anyone, and what she got for it was a drafty estate, a complicated husband, and the particular hollowness of discovering that the thing you worked for was not quite the thing you imagined working for. The society pages called her Triumph. The word is accurate, technically. The triumph was real. It was also, when examined from the inside, a considerably more nuanced experience than the word suggests, as most triumphs are in the Gilded Age and elsewhere, when you get close enough to them to see clearly. The estate, in the end, became its own kind of gilded cage, magnificent, significant, impressive from every external angle, and organised around requirements that left very little space for the person inside it to be anything other than its occupant. Sylvia managed this with the same methodical competence she had brought to every previous challenge. She became, by all accounts, excellent at the life she had chosen. Excellent and, in the specific way that the previous chapter described across all three of our composite figures, somewhat diminished by the excellence, ground down, gradually, by the gap between the life imagined and the life administered, until the woman who had been so vivid in her ambition had become, in some interior sense, a very well-organised household. She was not without moments of genuine satisfaction. The role, at its best, offered real engagement and real consequence. But the best of it could not quite undo the persistent awareness that she had poured 15 years of considerable human capability into this single outcome, and the outcome, while real, was not quite what all that capability had deserved, which is a feeling familiar to a great many people, in a great many circumstances, across a great many eras. What makes it Gilded Age specific is the narrowness of the channel that had forced all that capability into a single direction, and the completeness with which the era managed to mistake the smoothness of the channel for the freedom of the person moving through it. The Duke died eventually. The estate passed to the next generation, as estates do. Sylvia, now a widow, had more freedom than she had possessed at any point in her adult life, and found herself in her 60s not entirely sure what to do with it, which is itself a kind of commentary on what the preceding decades had required of her. She travelled. She was a considerable presence in whatever room she occupied. She was, by general consensus, remarkable. She was also privately working out for the first time what she might have done if the game had different rules, and finding that this was an interesting but not entirely comfortable question. The answer she arrived at from various letters and accounts that survived from her later years was not a catalogue of regrets about specific choices, but something more structural. A quiet recognition that the system she had navigated so brilliantly had cost her something she could not name with precision, but felt with great clarity. The something was not the marriage, or the estate, or the years of careful positioning. It was the version of herself that had existed before the campaign began. The girl of 13 who had been sharp and curious and hungry, before she had put all of that into a single and very specific project, and spent the next half-century administering its results. She did not say this to anyone directly as far as we know. She was not the type. But it is there in the record for those who are looking for it. The slight and habitual distance of a person who learned, too early and too thoroughly, to keep the most important parts of themselves in reserve, and then found, late in life, that the reserve had become the habit, and the habit had become the self, and the self beneath the habit had gotten very quiet, waiting to be needed. The version of the campaign that the Society press documented was naturally quite different from any of this interior accounting. What the newspapers saw and reported was a social success story of the most satisfying kind. The clever American girl who had set her sights on the grandest available prize and claimed it through a combination of charm, perseverance, and impeccable positioning. The transatlantic marriage had a reliable narrative groove by the time Sylvia achieved hers, and her story slotted into that groove with a satisfying click. American ambition meets European tradition. New World resources meet Old World ceremony. Everyone wins, the papers implied, and the wedding photographs confirmed, and the guest list suggested, and the descriptions of the flowers absolutely insisted. What the newspapers were not equipped to report was the interior experience of the woman inside the story, because the interior experience of women was not, in the early 20th century, considered a subject of legitimate journalistic inquiry. The relevant facts were external: the achievement, the alliance, the social position secured, the names of the guests, the number of bedrooms in the estate, the estimated value of the jewels. These were quantifiable. These could be documented. Whether Sylvia Wentworth-Cross felt, on the morning after her wedding, something that did not map neatly onto triumph, that was not in the vocabulary of available reportage, and so it was simply not there. This gap between the documented story and the lived one is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it runs through every life we're examining in this narrative, and it is not incidental to the tragedy. The tragedy, in many cases, is the gap itself, not the external circumstances, not the marriages or the money or the social positions, but the systematic inability of the era to see the person inside the circumstances, to register that there was an interior life that might differ from the social life, and to treat that difference as something worth paying attention to. The Gilded Age was not malicious in this omission. It was simply organised, at every level, around the visible and the quantifiable. Wealth was visible, position was quantifiable. The correct number of gowns for a season could be established with some precision. The warmth of a marriage, the satisfaction of a life, the degree to which any given woman was actually flourishing rather than merely functioning. These things did not show up in the data the era collected about itself, and therefore they were not, in any practical sense, part of the picture. And so, when the collapse came, as it eventually came for Sylvia, in a form different from and quieter than the spectacular unravellings we will examine shortly, but no less real for its quietness, it surprised everyone around her who'd been monitoring the external data and found it entirely in order. She had the estate, she had the title, she had the social position that 15 years of work had been aimed at. By every visible metric she was fine. The fact that she was not, in some interior register that nobody had thought to check, quite as fine as she appeared, that was genuinely invisible to the people around her, and almost invisible to herself, because she had spent so long managing the appearance that she had nearly lost track of the distinction. The machinery of social life in the Gilded Age was extraordinarily good at absorbing individual distress and converting it into social smoothness. A woman who was unhappy at home performed happiness in public, and the performance was good enough that it became the public reality, and the public reality was what went into the historical record, and the historical record is what we are still reading, which is why so many of these biographies look, on the surface, like success stories. They were success stories, by the operative definition. The operative definition simply did not include several of the criteria that would make it accurate. Sylvia herself contributed to this dynamic with great efficiency. She was an expert at the management of appearances. She had been practicing it for decades before it became strictly necessary, and she applied that expertise to her marital life with the same methodical care she had applied to everything else. Visitors to the estate found it beautifully run. Guests at the dinners she organised found her a magnificent hostess. Observers of her social presence found her formidable and charming in equal measure. Nobody found her unhappy, because unhappiness was not on the tour. This is not hypocrisy exactly. It is something more systemic, the expected and enforced management of interiority that the Gilded Age required of its women, conducted with such thoroughness and over such a long period that it had become second nature. The performance was not separate from the person. It had become part of the person, integrated so deeply into daily functioning that distinguishing one from the other required more self-examination than the era's social structures permitted or encouraged. There were periodically breaks in the surface, not dramatic ones, not the kind of breaks that generate the headlines and the medical consultations and the newspaper commentary that characterize the more spectacular cases we will get to, but small ones, visible if you were close enough and paying attention. A particular quality of stillness that came over her in the evenings after the guests had gone, a frequency with which she arranged to be alone, which was, for a woman of her social position and temperament, slightly unusual. An occasional comment, made to specific trusted people, and immediately afterward walked back to something more socially acceptable, about the gap between what she had expected and what she'd found. The trusted people, to their credit, registered these moments. They simply did not know what to do with them, because the era provided no framework for doing anything with them. If a woman had achieved everything the world said she was supposed to want and was not entirely satisfied, the only available conclusion was that the dissatisfaction was her problem, a failure of gratitude, a deficiency of contentment, something that reflected on her character rather than on the accuracy of what the world had been promising. The idea that the promise itself might have been incomplete, that the thing offered might have been genuinely insufficient, was a thought that required intellectual infrastructure the era had not yet built. What is striking, surveying these lives from our current position in time, is how consistently the women who are most clearly not fine are also the women who are most clearly performing fineness for the benefit of everyone around them. The more thoroughly a woman has been trained in the management of appearances, the better she is at concealing the state of the interior that the appearances are managing, and the better she is at that concealment, the longer the underlying difficulty goes unaddressed, and the further the eventual reckoning is from anything the people around her were expecting. Sylvia Wentworth-Cross does not end in the most spectacular category of collapse. Her particular story winds down more quietly, a long gradual withdrawal from engagement with a life that had delivered what she asked of it, and left her to discover, late and without much warning, that what she had asked for was not quite the same as what she had needed. She spent her later years in a kind of selective retreat, maintaining the social surfaces with professional competence while investing in them rather less than she once had, putting her genuine attention into smaller and more private pleasures that the world did not particularly notice or record. There is something quietly sad about this, and also something that resists pure sadness. She did, eventually, find the smaller pleasures. She found them late and in reduced quantity, but she found them. The capacity for genuine enjoyment that the 15-year campaign had deferred, and the subsequent decades of estate management had further deferred, turned out not to have entirely atrophied. It was still there, in her 60s and 70s, waiting with the patience of something that has learned to wait. She took it up carefully, as you take up a very old instrument that you're not sure still plays. It played. Not the same way it would have played if she'd taken it up decades earlier, in different circumstances, under different constraints. But it played. This is not a triumphant ending, but it is not a purely tragic one either, and that ambiguity is, in its way, more honest than the cleaner versions that the era tended to prefer. The Gilded Age liked its stories tidy, the ones that rose and the ones that fell, and the ones that served as cautionary tales about the consequences of transgression. Sylvia's story does not fit neatly into any of these categories. It is the story of a very capable person who played an extraordinarily difficult game with great skill and emerged from it with most of what she aimed for, and found that most of what she aimed for was not quite enough, and managed even that discovery with the competence she brought to everything else. The sharpest irony is this. The qualities that made Sylvia Wentworth Cross remarkable, the strategic intelligence, the patience, the ability to think in long horizons, the discipline to maintain a plan over 15 years of changing circumstances, were exactly the qualities that, deployed in almost any other direction, might have made her genuinely and durably happy. They were genuine and uncommon gifts, wasted on a goal that the era had told her was the appropriate destination for gifts of any kind. And the waste is legible now in a way it could not have been then, because we have the benefit of knowing what those gifts might otherwise have built. She built a very fine marriage and a very well-administered estate. Given the options available to her, this was probably the best she was going to do. That the best she was going to do was insufficient is not her failure. It is the failure of the world she was given to work with, which was generous in certain directions and catastrophically narrow in the ones that would have mattered most. She did what she could with what she had. Most people do. The question the Gilded Age never quite asked, and that we are still, in our way, working on answering, is why what so many people had was so persistently and specifically inadequate in the same ways, for the same reasons, producing the same outcomes across generations and social contexts that were different in their surfaces and nearly identical in their underlying logic. The answer to that question is what the rest of this story is for. We have seen the foundation, the childhood, and we have seen the campaign, the marriage, and we have seen the destination, the estate, the title, the position achieved and inhabited. What we have not yet fully examined is the machinery between them, the social systems, the press apparatus, the specific cultural mechanisms that took women of considerable capability and consistently, reliably, produced from them outcomes that fell short of what those capabilities deserved. That machinery is the next thing we need to look at, and it is considerably more elaborate and considerably more effective than it might appear from the outside. The machinery between the campaign and its consequences, the social systems that processed capable women into insufficient outcomes, turns out to have a very useful case study available, one that involves the most famous gemstone in American history, a woman who bought it specifically to prove she did not believe in curses, and a series of subsequent events that would, if you believed in curses, constitute a fairly compelling argument for the supernatural. We do not need to believe in curses to find the story useful. The structural explanation turns out to be considerably more interesting than the supernatural one, and considerably more disturbing, which is saying something given that the supernatural version involves a blue diamond responsible for centuries of misfortune. Her name, for the purposes of this narrative, is Rosalind Hartwell Pemberton, and she was, by any reasonable measure, the most spectacularly self-confident woman of the Gilded Age's later decades. Not the most beautiful, though she was attractive, not the most socially strategic, as our previous chapter has established the gold standard for that particular category, but confident in a way that was specifically unusual for the era, genuinely, constitutionally, almost philosophically certain of her own ability to handle whatever arrived. She came from Colorado mining money, which had a different quality than Eastern establishment money, rawer, newer, less encrusted with the social anxieties that come from caring too long about what the right people think. Her father had pulled his fortune directly from the earth with an energy that was still visible in the way his daughter moved through rooms. She did not drift. She arrived. She arrived, specifically, in Washington and New York society in the early 1900s, bringing with her a fortune substantial enough to command attention, a personality too vivid to ignore, and a relationship with social convention that was best described as selectively respectful. She kept the rules she found useful and bent the ones she didn't, with an awareness that money at sufficient scale purchases a certain latitude for eccentricity that is unavailable to its less well-resourced practitioners. This was, for its era, a reasonably accurate calculation. The Gilded Age had a price list for unconventionality, and Rosalind could afford the premium version. She married into one of the most significant press fortunes in the country, which added a media dimension to an already considerable financial position. The Pemberton family owned newspapers in the way that other families owned furniture, as a given, as background, as the thing that was simply there and had always been there, and would presumably continue to be there. The newspapers were profitable, they were influential, they had access to the corridors of actual political power in ways that made the social power of New York's ballrooms look decorative by comparison. Rosalind understood this immediately, and found it considerably more interesting than the ballrooms, because she was a person who was interested in power that actually did something, which put her somewhat at odds with an era that mostly wanted its women interested in power as performance. The jewel arrived in her life in the way that significant objects arrive in the lives of people with significant resources, as an opportunity presented by circumstances to do something that would make a statement. The stone in question was not the Hope Diamond specifically. We are, as always, compositing and displacing the actual historical specifics into our own frame, but it shared the essential characteristics: ancient, extraordinary, famously associated with misfortune through a legend that was probably confected in the 19th century by jewelers who understood that a good provenance story is a significant portion of a significant stone's value. The legend said that its owners came to grief. The legend was attached to a gemstone of such size and beauty that the attachment was, commercially speaking, an excellent investment. Good luck selling a stone that is merely extraordinary. A stone that is extraordinary and reportedly catastrophic is another proposition entirely. Rosalind Pemberton bought it, paid an amount of money that would have been a substantial fortune for most American families of the era, and then did something that was either magnificent or deeply unwise, depending entirely on your theory of how symbolic objects interact with human fate. She wore it to parties. She wore it to the kind of parties where people would notice and comment and write about it in the society columns. She let her children handle it with the casualness she applied to most things she owned. And she reportedly allowed her household dog, a large and cheerful animal with no discernible interest in either gemology or superstition, to wear it on his collar during at least one notable social occasion, which the newspapers covered with the delighted incredulity that the Gilded Age press reserved for moments when the very rich did something that perfectly crystallized their relationship with excess. The message she was sending was explicit and deliberate. I do not believe in curses. I believe in chemistry and physics and the specific gravity of crystallized carbon and the market value of large blue stones, none of which are subject to ancient maledictions. She was making a point about rationality and about the relationship between wealth and superstition and about her own specific brand of fearlessness, and the point was well made and widely received, and also, as it turned out, somewhat incomplete as a theory of how misfortune operates. Because the misfortune, when it arrived, was not supernatural. It did not arrive in the form of a curse activated by the purchase of a specific stone. It arrived in the entirely natural forms that the Gilded Age had been producing all along, operating through mechanisms that had nothing to do with ancient diamonds and everything to do with the specific structural vulnerabilities that the era created in the lives of its most prominent figures. The first thing that happened was the death of a child. This is, by any measure, the most devastating thing that can happen to a parent, and we want to be careful here not to treat it as a narrative element, rather than as what it was, the worst thing. Rosalind and her husband lost a son at an age when children are still entirely themselves, before the world has gotten to them, and the loss was the kind that reorganizes everything afterward into before and after, with no possibility of reversal and no framework in that era for processing it that went beyond grief performed publicly and grief endured privately. The Pemberton household in the years after this loss was a place where every surface continued to function and the interior had been permanently altered, which was, as the preceding chapters have established, essentially the operating condition of the Gilded Age at full volume. Then her husband began to deteriorate, not suddenly, not dramatically in the first instance, but in the gradual way that certain psychological conditions present in people who have been under sustained and extreme pressure. The kind of pressure that comes from operating a significant media enterprise through decades of enormous social and political change, while also managing an enormous private fortune, while also navigating a marriage to an extremely forceful personality, while also processing a grief that the era provided essentially no tools for processing. He was not a weak person. He was a person who had accumulated more than his system could carry, which is a different thing, and it is important to say that plainly because the Gilded Age had a habit of describing the mental deterioration of men in ways that implied personal failure rather than structural overload. The legal machinery that eventually declared him unfit to manage his affairs was, in its way, as telling a document about the era as anything in the social columns. It formalized a condition that had been developing over years, stripped him of his decision-making authority, and deposited the management of his affairs into the hands of a court-appointed system that operated with the efficiency and sensitivity that court-appointed systems tend to bring to matters they have been asked to administer rather than actually understand. Rosalind navigated this with the competence she brought to everything, which meant she handled it well, and was absolutely ground down by the handling. The newspaper empire, which had seemed as solid as the stones in the buildings that housed it, turned out to be rather more vulnerable than its appearance suggested. Media enterprises in the early 20th century were subject to pressures that the people who had built them in the previous century had not anticipated. The shifting economics of advertising, the changing technologies of information distribution, the political currents that run through any institution that is in the business of telling people what is happening and why. The Pemberton newspapers were not uniquely badly managed. They were managed by people dealing with enormous personal crises while simultaneously trying to maintain business operations during a period of economic instability that was making everyone's finances interesting in ways nobody particularly wanted. The confluence of personal catastrophe and economic pressure produced outcomes that each factor alone might not have produced, which is, in the history of Gilded Age fortunes, a very familiar sequence. The gemstone got pawned during the Depression. This is the detail that newspapers tended to treat as the most telling, perhaps because it has a certain neatness to it. The famous stone, purchased in a gesture of conspicuous rationalism, ends up in the hands of a pawnbroker during the era's most spectacular demonstration of the limits of financial confidence. The symbolism is almost too tidy. Life in the Gilded Age, and in the Depression that followed it, was rarely quite this narratively coherent, which is why the story tends to get reported in the version that emphasizes the tidiness, rather than the much messier reality underneath it. The messier reality is this: a woman who had spent her entire adult life operating with the expansive confidence that very large amounts of money make possible had been systematically reduced, through a sequence of events none of which she had chosen, and none of which she could have been reasonably expected to prevent, to a position where selling a jewel was a practical necessity rather than a symbolic act. The symbol was the stone. The reality was the woman who had to sell it, at an age when she had expected to be passing it on rather than parting with it, in circumstances that would have been unimaginable from the vantage point of the afternoon she bought it, and sent the jewellers away with the cheerful confidence of someone who expects the future to cooperate with their plans. The future, as it tends to, had its own ideas. What is particularly worth examining in Rosalind Pemberton's story is the specific nature of her confidence, and how it both served her and failed her. The confidence was real. It was not performance, not the social poise that we have already discussed at length in the previous chapters, the practiced composure of women trained to appear contained. Rosalind was genuinely, temperamentally sanguine in a way that was somewhat unusual for women of her class and era. She expected things to go well because she had mostly experienced them going well, and she expected her own capability to manage any situation that did not go well, because she had mostly experienced her capability being adequate to the situation she encountered. This is not arrogance exactly, though it looked like arrogance to people who are more anxious by nature or less well resourced by fortune. It is rather a reasonable conclusion drawn from limited data. If everything in your experience has been manageable by virtue of who you are and what you have, the assumption that everything you will encounter will be similarly manageable is entirely logical. The problem with this reasoning is that it extrapolates from a dataset that is, by its nature unrepresentative. The things that have not happened to you yet are not in your data, and the things the Gilded Age was capable of producing, the specific compounded losses that came from being deeply embedded in a social structure that was beginning, in the first decades of the 20th century, to show significant signs of instability, were not in anyone's dataset in a usable form. The era was changing underneath the people who lived in it, more rapidly and more thoroughly than most of them realized from the inside. The structures of Gilded Age life, the social hierarchies, the economic arrangements, the assumptions about wealth's permanence and its protections, had been built during a period of extraordinary expansion and had never been tested against sustained contraction. The Depression, when it arrived, was the test, and the people who had built their lives most completely inside the structures of the previous era found that the structures were less durable than advertised, which is another way of saying that the people who had most to lose lost most. Rosalind Pemberton lost in stages, which is its own particular form of difficult. A sudden and complete catastrophe has a certain terrible clarity to it. Everything is gone, the new baseline is established, and the process of rebuilding, however painful, can at least begin. A loss in stages is different. Each stage is manageable, at least nominally, and the manageability of each stage makes it possible to continue functioning as though the underlying trajectory is not pointing in the direction it is. You adjust, you adapt, you sell the stone and tell yourself and everyone else that it was time to let it go anyway, and the telling is convincing enough that you half believe it yourself and you proceed, because proceeding is what people like Rosalind Pemberton do. She proceeded for a long time. She was to the end of her life someone who filled rooms when she entered them, who retained the quality of arrival that had characterized her at her peak. The circumstances contracted around her, with a completeness that was, from outside, genuinely striking. The fortune diminished, the press empire gone, the husband institutionalized, the child buried, and she managed each contraction with the competence that she had always brought to management, until the competence itself became a kind of courage, ordinary in its daily expression and extraordinary in its cumulative weight. This is the thing about Rosalind that the curse narrative misses entirely, because the curse narrative is interested in the downward arc rather than the person inside it. The person inside it was still there, still capable, still engaged with whatever life had currently made available to her, which is not nothing. It is, in fact, rather a lot. The Gilded Age was quite good at destroying the external circumstances of people's lives, their fortunes, their social positions, the material infrastructure of everything they had built. It was somewhat less successful at destroying the people themselves, at least the ones who had the specific kind of inner resource that does not depend on external circumstances for its supply. Rosalind had that resource. It had been tested in ways she had not anticipated, and had not entirely survived intact, but enough of it remained to constitute a life, even after the most elaborate losses. What she did not have, and what the curse narrative also cannot see, is the thing that the preceding chapters have identified as the consistent absence in these stories: the freedom to have been something different, to have taken the considerable intelligence and the genuine fearlessness and the extraordinary organizational capability she demonstrated across her adult life, and aimed them at something beyond the social sphere, beyond the management of houses and entertainments, and the maintenance of a position that was always, ultimately contingent on wealth that she had not made, and on a husband who was not always making good decisions with the wealth he had. The question of what Rosalind Pemberton might have built if the rules of her era had been different is, like similar questions about the other women in this story, not a question the era could hear, because the era was not set up to take it seriously. The stone itself had a career after Rosalind. It passed through several more hands, was assessed and reassessed, and eventually came to rest in a place where the most people could see it, in a public institution, behind glass, admired daily by visitors who receive the legend along with the visual experience and generally find it more compelling than the provenance. This is approximately correct, as resolutions go. The stone belongs to everyone now, which is not the worst outcome for something that was bought, at great expense, to demonstrate a point about the irrelevance of superstition. The point, as it turned out, was not quite so clear as the purchase suggested. Not because the superstition was real, it was not, is not, and the stone is a stone, but because the circumstances that followed the purchase were real, and they were produced not by a malediction in any ancient sense, but by something more contemporary and more legible. the specific combination of structural vulnerabilities that the Gilded Age created and the early 20th century then systematically dismantled. The dismantling caught the people inside those structures in various stages of being caught, depending on how thoroughly their lives were built on foundations that the era was withdrawing. Rosalind Pemberton's life was built very thoroughly on those foundations, because she had arrived with the optimism of someone who expected foundations to hold. The foundation held longer than some, and failed more completely than others, and the woman standing on it managed the failure with a dignity that the legend of the cursed stone does not quite accommodate, because legends prefer drama to competence, and spectacle to the quieter forms of human endurance. The legend is entertaining. The reality is harder to look at and considerably more instructive. It does not require an ancient curse to explain how a woman who had everything could end up with significantly less than she started with. It requires only an understanding of what the Gilded Age was built on, and what happens to buildings when the foundations begin to shift. Here is something the legend definitely does not cover: the specific way that wealth of the Gilded Age variety was organised to look more permanent than it was. The fortunes were large enough that their edges were invisible from the inside. You could spend lavishly, entertain extravagantly, acquire magnificently, and the bottom of the account simply never came into view because the account was too large, and the life too present, and the expectation too complete that abundance, once established, was simply the condition of existence rather than a circumstance with limits. This expectation was shared across the class. It was maintained by the social culture, reinforced by the press, and embodied in the physical structures, the houses, the estates, the consumption patterns, of everyone around you. If everyone you know is spending as though money has no flaw, the reasonable assumption is that money has no flaw. The reasonable assumption was wrong, but it was reasonable given the available information. The available information, as the early 20th century progressed, was being updated in real time with corrections that the previous generation had not been equipped to anticipate. The Depression did not arrive without warning signals. The economists can identify them retrospectively, and some identified them prospectively. But the warnings arrived in a language that the people inside the Gilded Age social world were not particularly equipped to read, because the language of financial fragility was not one that had been useful to them, and languages that are not useful tend not to be learned. Rosalind Pemberton was not uniquely unaware. She was averagely unaware, in the specific way of her class and era, and the average unawareness of the Gilded Age's upper reaches turned out to be a significant liability when the era itself began to contract. The contraction hit the most extended positions first and hardest, which meant the people who had spent the most, committed the most, built the tallest structures on the assumption of continued abundance. The Pembertons were, by this measure, considerably overextended, though the overextension was invisible until it was not. The particular poignancy of Rosalind's story, examined from this angle rather than the curse angle, is that almost none of the losses she experienced were individually the result of bad decisions in the narrow sense. The purchase of the stone was excessive but not economically catastrophic. The entertaining was lavish but not ruinous. The management of the newspapers was imperfect but not uniquely incompetent. It was the accumulation of the individually manageable that became, in aggregate, unmanageable, which is a structural observation rather than a personal one, and which points back, as these observations tend to the system rather than to the individual navigating it. The system was organised to produce exactly this outcome for a predictable category of person: the person who had been given abundance without being taught the fragility of abundance, the person who had been embedded in social structures that rewarded spending as a signal of position and penalised caution as a signal of inadequacy, the person who had been trained to believe that their own capability was a sufficient protection against any contingency, because their own capability had so far been sufficient, and the person who had not, could not, given the rules of her era, developed any form of identity or security that was independent of the circumstances now contracting around her. This last point matters most. What the Gilded Age failed to provide, for all its extraordinary resources, was any model of female identity that did not depend on the material and social circumstances it controlled. You were the house, the position, the stone, the husband, the newspaper, the social column. When those things went, you were the person who had lost them, and the person who had lost them was, in the era's accounting, a depleted version of the person who had had them, rather than simply the same person in different circumstances. Rosalind knew, at some level, that this accounting was wrong. But knowing it is wrong and living outside it are two very different things, and the living is the harder part. She lived outside it as best she could, which was better than many managed and not as well as she deserved. The stone sits in Washington now, blue and extraordinary, and entirely indifferent to the story attached to it. The story attached to it is entertaining, and the stone is beautiful, and the woman who once wore it to parties and sent her dog out in it as a joke was complicated and capable, and reduced by circumstances she managed better than most would have. And none of that fits on the placard in the museum, but all of it is the real story, which is, as usual, considerably more interesting than the legend. To understand why the curse narrative is so persistent, you have to understand what it offers that the structural narrative does not. A curse is satisfying in ways that social analysis is not. It has a clear origin point, a clear mechanism, and a clear logic. A thing was done, a price was owed, the price was paid. It is morally organized in a way that real catastrophe almost never is, because real catastrophe tends to be morally disorganized, the result of accumulating factors, poorly understood risks, structural vulnerabilities, and the perfectly ordinary bad luck of being a specific person at a specific intersection of historical forces that have nothing to do with your character or your choices. This kind of causation is difficult to narrate, and even more difficult to find satisfying, which is why the curse narrative persists. It is a better story in the purely structural sense, whatever its relationship with reality. The people who bought the curse narrative in Rosalind Pemberton's time were not stupid. They were people who found it easier to believe that misfortune came from external supernatural forces than to consider the possibility that the social system they lived inside was organized in ways that systematically produced certain kinds of outcomes for certain kinds of people. The second theory is harder to believe not because it is less supported by evidence, but because believing it requires something the first theory does not, a willingness to look at the system itself with a critical eye. And looking at the system critically, when you are inside it and dependent on it, and when everyone around you is also inside it and dependent on it, is a very uncomfortable project that most people, in most eras, decline to undertake unless the evidence becomes simply too compelling to ignore. The evidence was becoming too compelling to ignore slowly in the first decades of the 20th century. Not because of the individual stories, those were easy to absorb as individual misfortunes, idiosyncratic and therefore uninformative about any larger pattern, but because of the accumulation of them, the way the same shapes kept appearing in different lives lived at the same social level, the way the losses kept clustering in the same categories, falling on the same types of people through the same mechanisms. Anyone who was paying attention across enough cases and had enough intellectual independence to draw the obvious conclusion was beginning to see the outline of something systematic. Most people were not paying that kind of attention, because the Gilded Age was not an era that particularly incentivized systematic self-examination. It incentivized success, which was defined as the achievement and maintenance of the external circumstances of upper-class life, and it required the kind of full attention that achieving and maintaining those circumstances demands. You did not have a great deal of time inside the Gilded Age social world for the kind of reflective distance that would allow you to see the whole structure from outside. You were too busy being inside it. Rosalind Pemberton, whatever else she was always fully inside it. This is what her confidence expressed, before events complicated it. The complete habitation of her own circumstances, the investment of her whole self in the life she was living, the absence of the internal reservation that some of the women in our earlier chapters maintained as a kind of emotional protection. She was, in the best and most vulnerable sense, all in. She had not learned to keep part of herself in reserve, which meant she was exposed in ways that the more defended women were not, and the exposure cost her more when the losses came. There is an argument that the women who kept the most in reserve were the wisest, that the strategic management of the self that we saw in figures like Marietta Holloway, the maintenance of an interior life that was somewhat separate from the performed one, constituted a form of protection that served them better in the long run. There is something to this, but there is also something to be said for the opposite, for the Rosalind Pemberton approach of full engagement, of being entirely present in your own life rather than managing it from a slight remove. The cost of that approach, when things went wrong, was higher. The quality of the experience, when things went right, was probably also higher. Full presence is not obviously worse than strategic reservation, even though the reservation looks smarter in retrospect. The retrospect is the problem, as always. The Gilded Age left us an enormous retrospect. More documentation of its social world than any previous era, more photographs, more correspondence, more newspaper coverage, more memoir. And the temptation is to read that retrospect as though the outcomes were inevitable, as though the people moving through those beautifully documented lives were moving toward conclusions that were already determined. They were not. They were making choices under uncertainty, in the same condition of not knowing how things would turn out that characterizes all human experience at every period of history, and the choices were reasonable given the available information even when the outcomes were bad. Rosalind buying the stone was reasonable. Her confidence that she could manage whatever came was reasonable. Her decision to invest fully in the life she was living, rather than keeping one foot out the door as a hedge against unspecified future losses, was reasonable. None of it was the source of what happened. The source of what happened was the combination of structural economic fragility, personal loss of the most devastating kind, a husband's deteriorating mental health, and the specific way that all of these pressures interacted with each other across a period of years in a household that was, by nature and by choice, very fully extended in every direction. We are, at this point in the narrative, accumulating enough cases to see the pattern with some clarity, which is the purpose of examining them together rather than as isolated biographies. Marietta Holloway, contained by direct social pressure, eroded by the requirement to perform a self she did not entirely inhabit. Carolyn Fisk, hollowed by the absence of genuine emotional exchange in a life that was, on the surface, successful. Dorothea Price, sustained by extravagance until the extravagance was no longer sustainable, then suddenly exposed to the quiet she had been spending to avoid. Sylvia Wentworth Cross, arrived at the destination she'd aimed at for 15 years, and found it somewhat smaller than the map had suggested. And now Rosalind Pemberton, fully invested in a life whose foundations turned out to be less permanent than the investment required. 5 different women, 5 different specific circumstances, 5 different trajectories toward 5 different kinds of loss, and underneath all of them, the same structural reality. A social system that required women to build their entire identities and their entire senses of security on circumstances that the system itself controlled and could withdraw, that offered no alternative foundations, and that provided no vocabulary for describing the gap between what it promised and what it delivered. The curse narrative says the stone was to blame. The structural narrative says the era was organized in ways that reliably produced these outcomes, and the stone was a prop in a story that would have found its shape with or without it. The structural narrative is correct. It is also, as we have established, the less satisfying story, because it points at something large and systemic and says, this is what did this. And large and systemic things are harder to prosecute than cursed jewels, harder to point at, harder to hold responsible in any satisfying way. What you can do with the structural narrative is learn from it. You can look at the mechanisms it describes, the emotional isolation of childhood, the conversion of women into social symbols, the beauty standards that turned appearance into both currency and weapon, the strategic marriage market that redirected enormous capability into narrow channels, the absence of any identity foundation that did not depend on externally controlled circumstances. And you can ask which of these mechanisms are still operating, in modified forms, in the world that came after the Gilded Age. The answer to that question is interesting and somewhat uncomfortable, and entirely outside the scope of a curse legend about a large blue stone. The stone, to return to it one more time, is genuinely beautiful. If you ever have the occasion to see it in person, in its current institutional home in Washington, you will find that the photographs do not quite capture what it looks like under light. The depth of it, the specific quality of the blue, which is not the blue of water or sky but something more interior and more opaque, as though the colour goes all the way down. It is a remarkable object. It has, as remarkable objects tend to, accumulated a remarkable story in the course of its existence, and most of that story is not about a curse. Most of it is about the people who owned it, and what those people were navigating when the stone passed through their hands, and what the passing tells us about the world they were navigating it in. Those are the interesting parts. Those are the parts that explain, without reference to anything supernatural, how a woman who laughed at the idea of bad luck found herself, eventually, living inside so much of it. Not because a stone had power over her. Because the era she lived in was organized in ways that produced certain outcomes, and she had lived in that era completely and without reservation, and the outcomes arrived in the ways that the era's organisation reliably produced them. The stone does not explain that. The stone is just a stone. What explains it is the rest of everything we have been looking at, and will continue looking at, because the machinery still has several more demonstrations to offer, and the next one involves something that makes even a cursed diamond look relatively tidy by comparison: the press. The press, which we promised to examine at the end of the last chapter, turns out to be most usefully studied through a specific and somewhat extreme example. A woman whose entire adult life was conducted almost entirely in public, who never had the option of managing the gap between her interior and exterior experience in the controlled way that the previous figures managed theirs, because the newspapers were always already there, filling in the gap for her with whatever version of her life was most useful for that week's circulation. Her name, for our purposes, is Violet Hardcastle Lennox. She was 19 years old when she inherited a sum of money so large that announcing it in a newspaper during the early years of the Great Depression was, in retrospect, a communications decision of spectacular insensitivity. The newspapers announced it anyway. The sum was enough to constitute a small nation's annual budget, arriving in the hands of a teenager whose primary skill set at that point was looking beautiful in photographs, which the newspapers also documented extensively, because there is nothing the press of the 1930s found more compelling than a beautiful rich girl who could be simultaneously celebrated and resented with exactly equal energy. The resentment was immediate and genuinely comprehensive. This requires a small amount of context to fully appreciate, so here it is. The early 1930s were years of extraordinary economic misery for most Americans. Banks had failed, savings had vanished, unemployment had reached levels that made the normal human experience of financial anxiety seem almost quaint by comparison. People were living in very reduced circumstances in large numbers, and the national mood was not particularly warm toward the spectacle of inherited wealth. Into this atmosphere arrived the announcement that a teenager had just come into possession of a fortune that no reasonable person could spend in several lifetimes, and the atmosphere responded accordingly. The newspapers, which were in the business of giving the public what the public wanted, and what the public demonstrably wanted in 1932, was something to feel strongly about, found in Violet Hardcastle the perfect vehicle for a particular kind of collective emotion. She was sympathetic enough to keep you reading. She was young, she was clearly not entirely happy despite the money, she kept making choices that produced visible unhappiness, and unsympathetic enough to permit a certain pleasurable resentment that readers could enjoy without guilt. She was the poor little rich girl, which is a category that the press had essentially invented for her predecessor in actual history, and would now apply with great enthusiasm to every subsequent inheritor of conspicuous wealth who showed any sign of personal difficulty. The category required the subject to be both pitied and judged simultaneously, and Violet supplied ample material for both. The first marriage happened before the inheritance had properly settled, in the way that things happen when you are very young and have more money than you know what to do with and have grown up, as the first chapter of this narrative established, without any reliable models of what a functioning relationship actually looks like. The man she married was a count, which sounded more impressive than it was, as the specific title he held came with negligible, actual prestige and considerably more personal debt than the title's sound suggested. He was handsome, as the newspapers dutifully noted. He was charming, as the subsequent sequence of events suggests he must have been, given that someone married him. He was also, as became apparent at a fairly early stage of the marriage, primarily interested in Violet in the financial dimension, which might have been more obvious to a person with more experience of people being primarily interested in them financially. But Violet had not yet accumulated that experience, and would be required to accumulate it across several more marriages before it became, in any useful sense, informative. The Count departed eventually with a sum of money that represented several years of ordinary American household income for each of the years they had been married, which worked out mathematically to a very expensive education in a very specific subject. What Violet learned from this first marriage was not, unfortunately, what she needed to learn. She learned that she had made a bad choice, which is a more specific and less useful lesson than the broader structural insight that would have required her to understand why she was making that choice and what it was actually in service of. The broader structural insight required a kind of self-knowledge that nobody had equipped her with, and that the era did not particularly encourage, and so she proceeded, with the optimism that is either admirable or heartbreaking depending on your mood, to the second marriage. The second husband was selected with a different set of criteria applied, in that Violet had concluded from the first failure that the problem was the Count's European title, that European titles came with European attitudes toward marital fidelity and financial responsibility that were incompatible with her requirements, and that an American husband would be more straightforward. This theory had a certain logic and a certain naivety in roughly equal proportions, and the naivety portion revealed itself over the subsequent period with the quiet efficiency of naivety generally. The American husband was straightforward in the sense of being direct about what he wanted, which turned out to be approximately the same thing the Count had wanted, packaged in different cultural wrapping. The divorce settlement negotiated on his behalf by lawyers who were, unlike him, not straightforward at all, extracted a sum from Violet's estate that would have comfortably supported a small school for a decade. At this point the newspapers had settled into a rhythm with the Violet Hardcastle story that would characterize their coverage for the next several decades. The rhythm was, marriage announced with photographs and breathless coverage, marriage proceeds with periodic updates emphasizing the glamour and downplaying the difficulty, marriage ends with detailed accounting of the financial terms and editorial commentary about what this most recent failure says about the subject in question. The commentary was not, in the main, kind. It was also not, in the main, accurate. It attributed to personal failing what was more accurately attributed to structural conditions, but structural conditions do not generate the same reader engagement as personal failing, and the newspapers were well aware of the distinction. There is something almost impressive about the efficiency with which the press of this era could maintain two contradictory positions simultaneously. Violet was to be pitied because she was clearly unhappy, and Violet was to be judged because she was clearly making bad choices. The contradiction was invisible to most readers because the pity and the judgment appeared in different sections of the coverage, separated by enough distance that the logic connecting them never quite came into focus. You could read the sympathetic profile and feel genuinely moved by her isolation and her evident longing for connection. You could read the gossip column the same week and feel that she was getting approximately what her extravagance deserved. You could hold both feelings at once without noticing they were in tension, which is a remarkable cognitive achievement, and also the primary mechanism through which the Gilded Age's successor culture managed its relationship with extraordinary inherited wealth. The third marriage requires a slightly more careful examination, because it complicates the simple narrative of fortune hunters and naive heiresses that the first two suggest. The third husband was not primarily after money, he was primarily after status, which is a different thing, and he was also genuinely attracted to Violet in a way that the previous two had not been, or at least not demonstrably. He was a film actor of some celebrity, which gave him social currency that made him unusual in the roster of Violet's choices. He was, possibly for the first time, with someone who was not obviously using her. He was instead someone who found the relationship flattering in ways that had nothing to do with the financial dimension, and this novelty was, for Violet, intoxicating in a way that probably should have been a signal to pay more attention rather than less. The problem with the third marriage was not financial predation. It was incompatibility of a more ordinary and less narratively satisfying kind. Two people who were both accustomed to being the most interesting person in any given room, in completely different registers of interesting, who found each other genuinely compelling in the early stages and genuinely insufferable in the later ones, which is a common progression, and not one that requires either party to be villainous. They were both difficult, they were both used to getting their own way. They were both performing constantly for audiences that overlapped but were not identical. Violet for the social world she had inherited, the actor for the public world his career required, and the performances were exhausting enough individually that the additional work of maintaining a marriage on top of them turned out to be more than either person's bandwidth could sustain. They parted on terms that were, by the standards of Violet's divorces, almost civilized, which the newspapers found considerably less interesting than the financial carnage of the previous settlements, and covered accordingly. A divorce in which nobody was extorted is, journalistically, a much less satisfying document than one that involves lawyers arguing over several $1 million, and the coverage was commensurately brief. Violet proceeded to husband number 4 with the specific combination of hope and diminished expectations that defines the middle section of a long string of bad outcomes. Hope, because she had not yet given up on the possibility that one of these would eventually work, and diminished expectations because each failure had quietly recalibrated her sense of what working actually required. The fourth husband through the seventh form a sequence that is, at one level, simply repetitive. Different men, different specific failures, same essential pattern of selection, hope, disappointment and separation. And at another level, deeply informative about the specific psychology that the childhood the first chapter described produces in its adult subjects. Violet was not making random choices. She was making choices that followed a coherent internal logic, even if that logic was operating largely below the level of her conscious awareness and was systematically producing results she did not want. The logic was this: she had grown up, as we established very early in this narrative, without reliable evidence that she was lovable for who she was rather than for what she had. The people who had been closest to her in childhood had been, variously, paid to be there or present for reasons other than genuine attachment to her specifically. The lesson this teaches, received without words, absorbed through experience rather than through any explicit instruction, is that love is contingent, that it is conditional on your usefulness, your compliance, your willingness to provide whatever the person claiming to love you actually needs. And that the most honest version of a love available to you is the kind where the conditions are at least visible and openly negotiated, rather than the kind where they are hidden, and you discover them only when you fail to meet them. This is, in practical terms, an explanation for why Violet Hardcastle kept marrying men who wanted something from her that was identifiable and concrete. Fortune hunters and status seekers are, from one angle, exactly what they appear to be: predatory people taking advantage of a vulnerable target. From another angle, they are the only category of people whose interest in Violet made a kind of internal sense to her, because the interest was legible. She knew what they wanted. She knew, therefore, what she was to them: useful, valuable in a specific and quantifiable way. This was not love, but it was recognizable in a way that the messier, less transactional version of genuine feeling was not, because genuine feeling was something she had very little experience with and could not reliably identify. The later husbands, 5, 6, 7, took a different toll than the early ones. The early ones depleted her fortune in chunks. The later ones depleted something harder to quantify: her belief that things would eventually resolve into something resembling what she needed. Each failure required her to recalibrate, and the recalibrations accumulated in a way that the financial losses did not quite capture, because money can in principle be recovered, while the slow erosion of the conviction that connection is possible is a different category of loss, and considerably more difficult to reverse. By the time Violet Hardcastle had passed through most of this sequence, she was living in a way that alarmed people who had known her earlier. Not dramatically alarmed. She was not, at this stage, in the category of spectacular public breakdown that makes the front pages. She was in the quieter category of someone who had shrunk the perimeter of her life to a size she could manage without the energy she no longer had. Less entertaining, less social, less present in the ways she had previously been present, as though she had decided, at some point below the level of conscious decision, that the exposure of being present was no longer worth the costs it extracted. The press, which had covered her marriages with such reliable enthusiasm, did not quite know what to do with this more muted chapter. A woman who is no longer actively doing interesting things, whose life has contracted to a smaller scale of activity, is not the same story that justified all the previous coverage, and the press has never been particularly well equipped to cover the quieter forms of human struggle. It requires a scandal or an event or a quote or a photograph, and the quieter chapter of Violet Hardcastle's life produced limited quantities of all of these. The coverage became sporadic, and then occasional, and then essentially absent, which is its own kind of statement about the relationship between celebrity and humanity. You are news when you provide content, and when you stop providing content, you stop being news, regardless of whether you continue to be a person. She continued to be a person. This seems worth saying explicitly, because the coverage gap can create the impression that the story simply ended, that Violet Hardcastle receded into historical irrelevance at the point where she stopped generating usable newspaper material. She did not. She continued to live, in reduced and quieter circumstances, with the specific quality of someone who has had a great deal and lost most of it, and is working out what, if anything, remains that is genuinely hers. The working out was not theatrical. It did not make the papers. It was simply the ordinary, difficult, necessary project of a human being trying to locate herself after the externals that had constituted her public self had mostly dissolved. What remained was harder to describe than what had gone, which is also true of most things that matter. The enormous fortune was largely gone, not entirely, but reduced to a fraction of its original scale by the combined effects of the divorces, the spending habits of several decades, and the simple mathematical fact that large sums of money shrink when subjected to sustained and enthusiastic withdrawal. The social position had followed the fortune downward, as it reliably does in a world organised around wealth. The husbands were distributed across several countries and several decades of legal history. The press had moved on to the next available target. What was left was Violet herself, older, quieter, with a more accurate understanding of certain things than she had possessed at 19 when the inheritance arrived and the newspapers discovered her. The more accurate understanding was not entirely a comfort, but it was more honest than the alternatives, and honesty, even when it is not pleasant, is its own kind of possession. She had learned, at considerable expense, what she was not. She had not quite learned, by the end, what she was, but she was closer than she had started, which is something, and something is not nothing. The newspaper that had covered her most persistently published a small item when she died. The item was reasonably respectful, given the decades of coverage that had preceded it, and noted the marriages and the fortune and the famous nickname, "Poor little rich girl," that had followed her from her first appearance in the society columns to her last. What the item did not note, because items of this kind are not structured to note such things, was the gap between the nickname and the person it had been attached to. The nickname required a specific kind of Violet to be legible, passive, victimized by circumstances, defined by the relationship between her wealth and her unhappiness. The actual Violet was more complicated than that. She was not passive. She was not simply a victim. She was a person shaped by specific experiences, making specific choices in specific circumstances, doing the best she could with the tools she had been given by a childhood and a culture that had been, in various ways, insufficient to her needs. The nickname is still used. It is still applied when occasion arises to any wealthy woman who exhibits signs of personal difficulty, because the category it describes is apparently too useful to retire. Poor little rich girl. The irony embedded in those 4 words, the wealth that should prevent the poverty that persists despite the wealth, is real, and the observation it makes is accurate. But the observation stops at the surface, and the surface is not where the story lives. We have been going deeper than the surface for several chapters now, and what we have found is consistent enough to constitute a pattern. The wealth did not protect these women. In some cases, it actively endangered them, not because of any inherent evil in large sums of money, but because of the specific ways that large sums of money interact with a social system organized around their possession, in a cultural moment that provided no alternative foundations for identity or security. You were the money until you were not, and then the question of who you were without it was one that nothing in your history had equipped you to answer. Violet Hardcastle answered it slowly, partially, and with considerably more honesty than the newspapers that had covered her ascent had managed in any of their coverage. She answered it in private, without an audience, which was perhaps the only context in which the answer was available. The public version of Violet Hardcastle was always the version that the coverage required. Glamorous, tragic, quotable, available for the specific emotional function the audience needed her to serve. The private version was something smaller and more real, working out year by year what it means to be a person when the circumstances that defined you have been removed. That working out is the most interesting thing about her. Not the marriages, not the money, not the nickname. The thing she did after all of that, the quiet, undramatic, undocumented work of locating whatever was left, when the story as everyone had told it was finished. It did not make the papers, it rarely does. The active press, as opposed to the merely observational press, was a phenomenon that developed gradually through the Gilded Age and reached something approaching peak form by the early decades of the 20th century. The papers that drove this development were not the staid establishment publications that had been covering society for decades with a certain restrained formality. They were the newer, louder, more aggressive publications that had understood something that the older papers were still working out, that the reading public did not actually want news delivered in the dispassionate register of a legal document. They wanted stories, they wanted characters, They wanted someone to root for and someone to resent and, ideally, someone to worry about. And they wanted these things delivered with enough dramatic texture to distinguish the experience of reading the paper from the experience of reading a court record. The publishers who understood this earliest made fortunes of the kind that rivaled the industrial fortunes of the era, which tells you something about how effectively they had identified the market. What they were selling was not, in the end, information. It was a specific emotional experience, organised around real people who had the advantage of existing in ways that fictional characters do not, which gave the ongoing coverage the addictive quality of a serial novel where the characters are known to be real. Violet Hardcastle was not the only woman to serve this function. There were others, before her, and alongside her, and after her. But she served it with particular effectiveness because her life supplied the emotional register the papers required with great reliability. There was always another husband. There was always another settlement. There was always another photograph of a woman who was very beautiful and very rich, and apparently very unable to be happy about it, which is the emotional combination that generates the most complex reader response, and therefore the most sustained reader attention. The coverage of Violet Hardcastle, across the peak decades of her public life, would, if assembled in a single document, constitute one of the more remarkable portraits of media appetite ever produced. Not because the individual pieces were particularly well written, some of them were not, but because of the sheer accumulated volume of them, and what that volume reveals about the relationship between the press and its subjects in this period. The papers did not simply cover Violet. They constructed her. They created a version of Violet Hardcastle that was coherent, narratively satisfying, and emotionally functional for a large reading public, and they maintained this version with considerable consistency across decades of coverage, updating it as required by events but always bringing it back to the essential shape that the narrative required. What the construction did to Violet herself is harder to assess and more important to attempt. We know, from the accounts of people who knew her privately, that she was aware of the version of herself that existed in the press, and found it uncomfortable in ways she was not always able to articulate. She was aware that the newspaper Violet and the actual Violet were not identical, and that the newspaper version was more widely known and more fully believed, and that this gap between the public construction and the private reality was one she was required to live inside without any particular mechanism for correcting it. You cannot sue a newspaper for constructing an emotionally simplified version of you that happens to sell papers. The version in question is not factually inaccurate. The marriages, the money, the outcomes are all documented correctly. It simply omits the parts that would complicate the narrative, and omission is not actionable. The effect of living inside a publicly constructed version of yourself that is both recognizable and wrong is difficult to describe to anyone who has not experienced it, which is most people, and which may explain why the psychological cost of celebrity of this particular kind is so frequently underestimated. Violet was not dealing with the more extreme form of this experience that contemporary public figures navigate, with the additional amplification of social media and the internet. She was dealing with the pre-digital version, which was still substantial enough. The newspapers reached millions of people. The version of her they presented reached millions of people simultaneously, repeatedly across decades, and the version that reached those millions had the texture of truth even where it departed from it, because it was built on a foundation of real events described in the confident tone of factual reporting. What this meant in practice was that Violet spent most of her public life being responded to as the newspaper version of herself rather than as herself. People at parties knew who she was before she spoke. They knew, or believed they knew, what kind of person she was, what she had done, what her pattern of behaviour suggested about her character and her judgment. They responded to the version they had read about rather than the version standing in front of them, and the version standing in front of them, over time, began to adjust to this. Began, in the specific way that humans adjust to being persistently seen in a particular light, to perform elements of the expected character, because resistance required an energy that was increasingly difficult to maintain. This is one of the more insidious mechanisms through which the press shaped, rather than merely documented, the lives of its most sustained subjects. The coverage created expectations. The subject, embedded in a social world where everyone had read the coverage, found themselves navigating rooms full of people who were responding to the expected version. And the navigation of those rooms was easier in certain respects if you cooperated with the expectation. If you were, in some public degree, the Violet Hardcastle that the papers had constructed, rather than resisting it constantly and exhaustingly, which made every social interaction a small battle that produced no practical benefit. The cooperation was not total. There was always the private version, maintained in smaller circles among people who were capable of receiving it. But the energy that the maintenance of a private self requires, when the public self is so thoroughly and persistently constructed elsewhere, is not trivial, and over the years of coverage it extracted a cost that was real and essentially invisible to everyone who was not paying it. The fortune, meanwhile, continued its arc toward significantly less than it had started as. This is important to track with some precision, because the popular version of the story tends to imply that wealth of this scale dissipates through pure carelessness, through the sheer volume of extravagant spending that the newspapers documented so lovingly. The spending was real. It was also only one component of the dissipation. The legal fees associated with 7 divorce proceedings were, across the period in question, a significant sum in their own right. The settlements paid to departing husbands represented a transfer of capital that compounded over time. The cost of maintaining a lifestyle at the social level that the narrative required, the houses, the staff, the entertaining, the travel, the jewellery that the society pages expected to document, was ongoing and significant. And underlying all of it was the simple fact that large fortunes, absent active management by someone whose primary focus is their maintenance, tend to shrink, because money managed as a social prop rather than as a financial instrument does not compound in the ways that careful investment produces. Violet was not equipped to manage her fortune as a financial instrument, because she had been given the fortune at an age when financial management was not a subject she had been educated in, by a world that did not particularly expect women of her class to understand it, surrounded by advisors whose interests were not always identical with hers. This is a structural failure as much as a personal one, and it is worth noting that the same era which produced enormous fortunes also produced almost no infrastructure for ensuring that the people who inherited those fortunes had the tools to manage them effectively. The fortune was transmitted. The competence to handle it was considered either unnecessary or someone else's problem, which turned out to be an interesting theory that the subsequent financial histories of many Gilded Age inheritances subjected to a fairly comprehensive field test. The test results were not encouraging. The pattern across the generation of women who inherited substantial Gilded Age wealth is remarkably consistent. The fortune arrived, was subjected to the various expenses that the lifestyle required, was further reduced by the legal and financial costs of the marital histories that the era's social dynamics tended to produce, and diminished at rates that surprised the heirs, because the heirs had started from a position where the diminishment was, for a long time, invisible. You do not notice that a very large room is getting smaller until it is noticeably smaller, and by the time it is noticeably smaller, a significant portion of the shrinkage has already occurred. The invisibility of the early stages is part of the mechanism. If the losses had been visible from the beginning, some portion of them might have been preventable. Their invisibility was structural. Embedded in the way the social world of the Gilded Age was organized to present wealth as a permanent condition, rather than a balance that required active maintenance. Violet Hardcastle's balance, by the end, was a fraction of what it had started as. The number that remained was not nothing. She was not destitute in any literal sense, but it represented a degree of contraction from the original position that would have been, if announced in a newspaper in the manner of the original inheritance announcement, an equally spectacular headline, though of a different kind. The spectacular headline was never published, because by the time the contraction was complete, Violet Hardcastle was no longer a story the papers were actively following. She had passed from the category of current events into the category of historical record, which is its own kind of departure, and one that she appears to have found, by the accounts available, not entirely unwelcome. The press that had spent decades constructing its version of her moved on, as presses do, to the next available subject who supplied the required emotional ingredients in usable combinations. The notebook that had been labelled Violet Hardcastle, Poor Little Rich Girl, was closed and filed, and a new notebook was opened for someone else, and the cycle continued. This is the other thing about the press as a mechanism in these women's lives. It was not designed to follow any individual narrative to its natural conclusion, because natural conclusions are rarely good journalism. It was designed to cover the peaks, the marriages, the divorces, the spectacular moments of visible fortune and misfortune, and to leave the valleys, where most of life actually happens, relatively unattended. The valleys of Violet Hardcastle's later life were, by all available evidence, more genuinely interesting than the peaks that received all the coverage. They were where the actual thinking happened, where the actual reckoning occurred, where the actual Violet Hardcastle, as opposed to the newspaper construction with the same name, worked out what she actually thought about the life she had lived and what, if anything, she would have done differently given the option. The thoughts she arrived at were not the thoughts the newspapers would have found useful. They were quieter, more particular, less legible in the social language the papers spoke. They were the thoughts of a private person who had spent most of her adult life being a public one, and had emerged from that experience with a somewhat different understanding of the distance between those two categories than she had possessed at 19. She did not publish these thoughts. She shared them, selectively, with people she trusted, which was a smaller group than it might have been at an earlier point in her life, and a more genuinely selected one. The people in that group generally agreed, in retrospect, that the private Violet Hardcastle was considerably more interesting than the public one, which is not a finding that will surprise anyone who has followed this narrative to its current point. The finding is consistent with everything we have been establishing about the gap between the performed and the real in these women's lives. What is surprising, perhaps, is that the gap in Violet's case was survivable, that enough of the real had been maintained, through all the performance and the coverage and the marriages and the losses, to constitute something worth finding when the coverage finally stopped and the quiet arrived. She found it. Imperfectly, partially, later than she deserved, but she found it. And the finding, quiet as it was, is the part of her story that deserves to be remembered alongside the marriages and the nickname and the fortune that wasn't, in the end, as permanent as it looked from the outside when it was new. The active press we began examining at the end of the previous chapter was not simply a nuisance or an inconvenience. It was, in the most precise sense of the word, a machine. A machine with inputs, outputs, and a very clear operating logic. The inputs were real people in real circumstances. The outputs were narratives, constructed and simplified and packaged for mass consumption. And the operating logic, which the machine applied with impressive consistency across every subject it processed, was this: find the emotional register that generates the maximum sustained reader engagement, and maintain it, and feed it with whatever material the subject's life currently provides, and when the material runs short, find creative ways to supplement it. And when the subject stops cooperating with the narrative requirements, find a new subject. This is not a conspiracy. It is not the result of journalists who are evil, or publishers who are deliberately malicious, or editors who go home in the evening and laugh at the people they have been covering. It is the result of a system that has certain incentives and that responds to those incentives with the efficiency of any system that has clear metrics for success. The metric for success in the newspaper business of the Gilded Age and its immediate successor decades was circulation. Circulation was driven by reader engagement. Reader engagement was driven by emotional content. Emotional content was most reliably generated by certain categories of story. Wealthy women in distress were one of those categories. The category was reliable, renewable, and extraordinarily cost-effective, because the subjects generated their own material with minimal journalistic intervention required. The yellow press, the term the era used for its most aggressive tabloid publications, named after a comic strip character, and meaning, essentially, sensationalist, understood this dynamic better than the more respectable papers, and exploited it more thoroughly, though the respectable papers exploited it more than they generally acknowledged. The yellow papers were less circumspect about the exploitation. They were also, consequently, more honest about what they were actually doing, which is an interesting kind of integrity, and also not one that was particularly useful to their subjects. The specific techniques the yellow press developed for covering wealthy women in difficulty were sophisticated enough that they deserve systematic examination, because they operated as a system, and understanding them as a system helps explain outcomes that would otherwise appear to be random or the result of particularly bad luck on the part of the individuals involved. They were not bad luck. They were the predictable output of a media apparatus that was organized to produce specific kinds of stories about specific kinds of people, and that was very good at its job. Technique 1 was the flattering assent. When a young woman of wealth and beauty first appeared in the coverage, The papers treated her with the sustained warmth of a sponsor who has identified a promising investment. The coverage was celebratory. The photographs were the best available. The descriptions were generous. This phase served a specific function. It established the subject in the reader's imagination at a high point, created an attachment to the idealized version, and set up the emotional baseline from which subsequent coverage could depart in the downward direction that generates the most sustained reader interest. You cannot have a fall without a peak, and the peak was constructed with considerable care and genuine enthusiasm, because a well-constructed peak makes a much better fall. Technique 2 was the selective documentation. During the middle phase of coverage, the papers documented what was useful and ignored what was not. The marriages received enormous coverage. The private unhappiness between marriages received almost none. The spectacular social events were photographed and described at length. The quiet evenings that constituted most of any human life were invisible. The financial excesses were tallied with the enthusiasm of an accountant who's been told that accuracy is less important than drama. The financial management, where it existed, was unremarkable from a narrative standpoint and therefore absent. The result of this selective documentation was a portrait that was factually accurate in its specific claims and deeply misleading in its overall impression, the most useful kind of distortion because it cannot be specifically contested. Technique 3, and possibly the most insidious, was what we might call narrative momentum. Once a story had established its basic shape, poor little rich girl, tragic beauty, society woman in decline, the subsequent coverage was organised around that shape regardless of whether the actual life of the subject was cooperating with it. Events that fit the shape were reported prominently. Events that contradicted it were reported briefly, if at all, or were framed in ways that reintegrated them into the existing narrative. A divorce that appeared to be mutual and relatively civilized became, in coverage shaped by narrative momentum, another installment of the ongoing tragedy. A period of genuine stability and apparent contentment became, in the same coverage, the quiet before the next storm, or evidence of a performance concealing continued misery. The shape was maintained. The subject was interpreted through the shape, and the shape was, by its nature, downward pointing. This is the machinery we need to understand before we examine its most dramatic product, the case that represents the press not merely as an observer or a narrator or even a shaper of lives, but as a direct participant in a mystery that was never solved and that illuminates, more clearly than any other single case, the full reach of what the Gilded Age media apparatus could do when it encountered a story of sufficient dramatic potential. The story begins, as these stories often do, with an ordinary December morning in New York. The year is 1910. The city is at the full height of the Gilded Age's final flowering. The great estates, the elaborate social season, the newspapers that cover all of it with breathless and not always scrupulous attention. A young woman, the daughter of one of New York's most established families, goes out in the morning for a routine errand. She has some shopping to do on one of the city's premier commercial streets. She has a plan for the afternoon. She is, by every available indication, conducting a perfectly ordinary day. She does not come home. Her name, in our telling, is Constance Everett Marsh. She's 25 years old. She comes from a family that has occupied one of the better addresses in New York for 2 generations, whose name appears in the social columns with the comfortable regularity of things that are simply assumed to be present, whose position in the city's hierarchy is so well established that it rarely requires demonstration. This is old money, with all of old money's specific characteristics: the discretion, the assumption that public attention is something to be managed rather than sought, the deep and practiced avoidance of scandal as the primary operating principle of the household. The family has never been in the newspapers for anything undignified. This is, they consider, as it should be. Constance herself is not, by the limited accounts available, unhappy in any dramatic or immediately obvious way. She has the particular quality of composure that the previous chapters have identified as the operating mode of the well-trained Gilded Age daughter, the ability to present a smooth and appropriate surface regardless of what the interior might be doing. She is educated, she is presentable, she has the social skills that her upbringing has equipped her with, and she is, at 25, approaching the age at which a young woman of her class is expected to have already made a good marriage or to be actively in the process of making one. Whether this expectation is producing any particular pressure is not recorded, because pressure of this kind was not generally recorded in the era's available documentation. She goes out. She is seen, briefly, by someone she knows. She completes at least one of her intended shopping stops. And then, somewhere in the ordinary commercial activity of a December morning on a busy New York street, she simply stops being findable. The family, when she is not returned by evening, is not immediately alarmed because the first reasonable assumption is that there is an ordinary explanation. Perhaps she has gone to visit a friend and lost track of the time. Perhaps there has been a minor mishap that will resolve itself. The Everett Marsh household maintains its composure and waits. By the next morning, when there is still no word, the composure is maintained, but the waiting has acquired a different quality. What the family does next is the most revealing decision in the entire story. And it tells you more about the Gilded Age than almost anything else in this narrative. They do not go to the police. They go to a private detective because going to the police would risk exactly the thing they are most committed to avoiding: public attention. The logic is entirely consistent with the values of their class and their era. A scandal is, in the accounting of old money New York, a worse outcome than almost any specific misfortune, because a specific misfortune can eventually be absorbed, managed, and filed under unfortunate circumstances, while a scandal is permanent in the way that public knowledge is permanent, once known, never entirely unknowable. They hire the detective, they begin a private investigation, and they maintain the appearance, in the social world that surrounds them, that nothing is wrong. They maintain this for 6 weeks. This is, when you sit with it for a moment, an extraordinary period of time. 6 weeks of knowing that a family member is missing, of conducting a private investigation, of appearing at social events and accepting invitations and presenting the usual front, while underneath all of it the specific terror of an unexplained absence is simply running. 6 weeks of performing normalcy while living inside anything but. It is, in its way, the most complete expression available of what the Gilded Age required of the people inside it, the capacity to maintain the performance under conditions that would break most performances entirely. The performance broke, eventually, not from within but from outside. A leak, the specific source of which was never definitively established, reached one of the city's newspapers. The paper published the story, and at that point, with the velocity that information achieves once it escapes the container that has been trying to hold it, the case became exactly what the family had spent 6 weeks working desperately to prevent it from becoming: a national spectacle. The press response was immediate, comprehensive, and organized around the emotional requirements of the story rather than the investigative requirements of the case, which is a distinction worth maintaining clearly because the two things are not the same. What the emotional requirements demanded was drama, mystery, and the specific pleasure of speculation about the fate of a beautiful young woman from a prominent family. What the investigative requirements demanded was careful and methodical examination of available evidence, systematic interviews with people who might have relevant information, and the disciplined management of the gap between what was known and what was hypothesized. The press provided the first very enthusiastically and the second only incidentally, when the second happened to overlap with the first. The witnesses who came forward once the story broke were, unfortunately, the precise category of witness that every serious investigator most wishes would stay home. People who had read the story in the newspapers, absorbed the emotional register of the coverage, and generated from this combination a memory of having seen something relevant. These testimonies were not, in most cases, deliberately fabricated. They were the product of the entirely genuine human tendency to construct memories that are shaped by expectation and suggestion, which is a well-documented phenomenon and one that the yellow press of 1910 was operating to exploit with impressive effectiveness, though without any understanding of the cognitive mechanism it was leveraging. The result was that the investigation proceeded in the wrong directions, not because the investigators were incompetent, some of them were not, but because the volume of false information flooding in from newspaper-reading witnesses drowned out the smaller and harder-to-detect signal of anything that might have been genuinely useful. The father, who was not a stupid man, spent what would now be the equivalent of several $1 million pursuing leads that originated in newspaper speculation and terminated in nothing. Each lead required investigation, because in the early stages of a missing persons case, you cannot know in advance which leads are real, and the investigation of each false lead consumed resources of time, money, and attention that might otherwise have gone toward something more productive. The newspaper had in effect generated a smokescreen through the sheer volume of its coverage, and the smokescreen functioned as an impediment to the investigation it was nominally aiding. The theories that the coverage generated were plentiful enough to constitute a small library, She had been kidnapped, said one faction, and the prominent family was concealing the ransom demands out of fear for her safety. She had eloped, said another, with a man her family found unacceptable, and the disappearance was voluntary rather than criminal. She had gone to Europe, said a third, to pursue a life that New York's social constraints would not permit her, an artist's life, or a writer's life, or simply a freer life, under a different name in a different city. She had, said the most dramatic faction, died by her own choice, in a manner and location that had not yet been found, driven to this conclusion by pressures that the family was concealing because acknowledgement would be more damaging than permanent mystery. Each theory generated its own supporting evidence, in the way that theories tend to do when the evidence base is large enough, and the people assembling the evidence are motivated by the theory, rather than by the evidence. Each theory also attracted its own advocates, who wrote letters to the newspapers, which the newspapers published, which attracted more advocates, which generated more letters, in a cycle that was extremely satisfying from a circulation standpoint, and contributed essentially nothing to finding Constance Everett Marsh. The family, caught inside this circus while also genuinely trying to find their daughter and sister, was subjected to a form of media attention that has no modern equivalent precisely calibrated to its specific quality, though social media has produced approximations. Reporters stationed themselves outside the family home with a persistence that would have been recognizable to any modern celebrity enduring an unwanted level of press attention, though in 1910 the persistence was physical rather than digital. Actual human beings, in the cold, with notebooks, waiting for something to happen. The family members who had to navigate in and out of their own home did so past this permanent audience, which generated photographs that the papers ran with the enthusiasm of people who understand that grief and bewilderment are extremely legible emotions that require no caption to communicate. The investigators hired by the family eventually concluded, with varying degrees of confidence, that Constance had most likely left New York voluntarily, and under circumstances she had chosen not to share with her family in advance. The evidence for this conclusion was circumstantial, a pattern of behaviour in the weeks before her disappearance that, reviewed with hindsight, suggested someone preparing for a departure. But it was more coherent than the alternatives. It was also, from the family's perspective, the most difficult possible conclusion to accept, because voluntary departure required acknowledging that their daughter had been unhappy enough to leave without a word, in a manner calculated to prevent pursuit, which raised questions about the household and the life she had been living inside it, that the family was not, by temperament or tradition, equipped to examine. The questions were not examined, at least not publicly. The case remained officially open. The theories continued to circulate, diminishing in intensity over the years, but never quite disappearing, because the disappearance of a wealthy young woman from a prominent family in broad daylight is the kind of story that attaches itself to the cultural memory with considerable persistence. Every few years a new article would revisit the case, assess the old theories, sometimes propose new ones. None of them added anything of substance to what was known. All of them added to the archive of coverage that is now, over a century later, essentially all that remains of the public record of Constance Everett Marsh. The actual Constance, wherever she went, however the story ended for her privately, exists in that archive as a mystery, which is, in its way, the most complete example available of what the press of the Gilded Age could do to a person, convert them from a human being with an interior life and a specific set of circumstances into a story, and then maintain the story with such thoroughness that the person inside it becomes genuinely inaccessible, buried under the weight of the coverage that was supposed to find her. There is a particular cruelty in this, even when it is unintentional, which it largely was. The newspapers that covered the Everett Marsh disappearance were not trying to harm anyone. They were doing what newspapers do, finding the most compelling story available and covering it with the resources and the attention that the story's compelling qualities justified. The harm was a side effect of a process that was, from the newspaper's perspective, operating exactly as designed. This is, once again, the structural argument rather than the personal one. The harm did not require evil intent. It required only a system organized around certain incentives, operating without particular awareness of or concern for the effects it was producing on the people it was covering. The effects on the Everett Marsh family were real and lasting. The father, who spent the equivalent of several years' worth of significant income chasing leads generated by newspaper speculation, died without knowing what had happened to his daughter. The mother, who who had maintained the family's public composure through the 6-week silence and the subsequent media circus and the years of ongoing coverage, developed a quality of reserved withdrawal that people who knew her in later years described consistently. A person who was present but somehow not fully there, as though she had departed in some interior sense from active engagement with a world that had demonstrated its capacity to produce the specific and unresolvable loss she was now carrying. The social world that had been so central to the family's identity continued to function around them, but their participation in it had a different quality. The performance maintained, but the investment reduced, in exactly the way that all the previous chapters have described as the operating mode of people who have learned, at cost, that the performance is not protection. The disappearance is a mystery that will probably remain one, because the evidence that would resolve it is gone, if it ever existed in recoverable form, and the people who had it are long dead. But the mystery, properly understood, is not the interesting part. The interesting part is everything surrounding the mystery. The 6 weeks of silence, which tell us about the priorities of old money in the Gilded Age. The media response, which tells us about the mechanics of how the press converted private tragedy into public entertainment. The investigative failure, which tells us about how the volume of coverage can actively impede the truth rather than uncovering it. And the family's long aftermath, which tells us about what it costs to be the people inside the story that the press has decided to tell. The press moved on, of course, it always does. The Everett Marsh case became a historical curiosity, referenced occasionally in overviews of Gilded Age mysteries, treated as an interesting puzzle rather than as what it actually was: a family destroyed, a woman erased, and a media apparatus that had participated in both while reporting on the erasure with the confident detachment of an observer rather than the awareness of a participant. The awareness of participation is the thing the press of this era most consistently lacked. The papers understood themselves as witnesses to events rather than as forces acting on them, which is a comfortable self-image and not an entirely accurate one. When your coverage of a disappearance generates thousands of false witness reports that redirect a search in the wrong directions, you are not a witness to the investigation's failure. You are a contributor to it. When your coverage of a wealthy woman's marriages constructs a public version of her that shapes how everyone she meets responds to her, and that public version then influences the choices she makes to manage those responses, you're not simply documenting her life. You are involved in it. The Gilded Age press never fully reckoned with this involvement. The following century's press reckoned with it partially and inconsistently. The question of how much accountability a media apparatus bears for the outcomes it participates in producing is one that remains, depending on who you ask and in what context, entirely open. What the cases we have examined here suggest is that the accountability is real, and that it operates whether or not it is acknowledged, and that the people who paid the cost of the unacknowledged accountability were, systematically and without exception, the people who could least afford to pay it, the subjects of the coverage, who had no mechanism for correcting the narrative about them and no recourse against the harm the narrative produced. The Gilded Age gave us many things worth examining: extraordinary wealth, extraordinary culture, extraordinary social complexity, and a record of human aspiration and human failure that remains instructive over a century later. It also gave us the template for the relationship between media and celebrity that subsequent decades refined and amplified into forms that Constance Everett Marsh's father, standing outside his own house in the cold, would have found entirely familiar in their emotional logic and unimaginably large in their scale. The scale has changed. The logic has not. And understanding the logic, which is what the cases in this narrative collectively supply, is the beginning of being able to see it clearly enough to ask what we actually want from the systems that produce it, which is a question the Gilded Age did not ask, and that the subsequent century asked only partially, and that remains, with some urgency, available to whoever is willing to take it seriously. The question of what the Gilded Age wanted from its media is answerable, at least in outline, because the answer is visible in what the media provided. It wanted entertainment organised around real people. It wanted the specific emotional experience of proximity to wealth and beauty without the inconvenience of actual proximity. It wanted to feel superior and fascinated and sympathetic simultaneously, which is a complex emotional state that the coverage of wealthy women in distress reliably produced, and which the newspapers reliably provided in return for the circulation numbers that made all their other activities financially viable. The transaction was straightforward. The cost, borne by the subjects rather than the readers or the publishers, was not part of the calculation. What the subjects wanted from the press, on the occasions when they were asked, or when they expressed preferences in surviving correspondence, was considerably simpler: accuracy. They did not generally object to coverage as such. Most of the women we have examined understood that their social position involved a degree of public visibility and accepted this as the price of the position. What they objected to, when they objected at all, was the specific gap between the version the newspapers constructed and the version they were actually living. The gap was not incidental. It was, as we have established, structural to the enterprise, and the objection, however sincere, had no practical mechanism for enforcement. You could dislike the portrait. You could not change it. The press, in this period, operated without the legal constraints that subsequent decades introduced around defamation and privacy, which meant that the balance of power between publication and subject was almost entirely in the publication's favour. A story could be printed if it was sufficiently interesting and sufficiently connected to real events, even if its framing was misleading, its conclusions unwarranted, and its effect on the subject damaging. The subject's options were limited to the private expression of displeasure and the public performance of graceful acceptance, neither of which produced any correction of the record. The record stood. The readers had the record. The subject had the knowledge that the record was wrong, which is the kind of knowledge that is very difficult to deploy usefully. There is a practical lesson embedded in all of this that went largely unlearned by the era that produced it. The lesson is that the power to define a person in public language is a form of power with real consequences, and that the exercise of that power without accountability to the people being defined produces systematic harm of a kind that is difficult to document because it operates through accumulation rather than through discrete events. No single newspaper article about Violet Hardcastle ruined her. No single photograph of the Everett Marsh family destroyed them. The harm was the aggregate of thousands of small acts of construction and framing and selective emphasis, compounding over years and decades into something that shaped lives in ways that no individual actor could be held responsible for, and that the system as a whole never acknowledged as its product. This is the definition of structural harm, and it is one of the things the Gilded Age both produced and failed to see clearly. The individual journalists were not, in the main, cruel. The individual editors were not, in the main, deliberately malicious. The individual readers were not, in the main, callous. The system they were all participating in produced outcomes that would have required cruelty or malice or callousness to produce if they had been individually generated, but that emerged instead from the aggregate operation of people doing their jobs in accordance with the incentives their jobs created. This is how most systemic harm works. It rarely requires anyone to be specifically evil. It requires only a structure that rewards certain behaviours and ignores their consequences, and enough people operating within that structure to generate the consequences at scale. The Gilded Age had the structure, it had the people, it had therefore the consequences. And the consequences were borne by the women whose lives we have been examining, and by the many more whose names we have not had space to include, and by the families and households that surrounded them, and by the culture that absorbed the lessons of all this coverage without quite connecting the coverage to what it was actually teaching. What it was teaching, consistently, across decades of stories about wealthy women in distress, was a specific and limiting set of ideas about what those women were and what their difficulties meant. It taught that wealth without wisdom produces predictable tragedy, which is partially true and importantly incomplete. It taught that beautiful women with large fortunes attract the wrong kind of attention, which is true, but manages to frame the victim as the source of the problem rather than the structure that produced both the fortune and the attention. It taught that the specific form of female distress visible in these lives was the result of personal failing rather than structural conditions, which is the interpretation most useful for the newspapers and least useful for everyone else. The everyone else, which includes the actual historical record, and anyone reading it now benefits from a different interpretation, not one that removes all individual agency from the women involved. They made choices, real ones, with real consequences, but one that understands those choices in the context of the childhoods that formed them, the social structures that constrained them, the marriages that were shaped by those constraints, the press that covered all of it through a specific and distorting lens, and the broader system that organized all of these elements into the particular shape they took during this particular and extraordinary period of American history. The press's role in that system was not incidental. It was central. The newspapers did not merely observe the Gilded Age. They were part of it, shaping the norms they reported on, influencing the behaviors they documented, constructing the version of reality that millions of people used to understand their world and their place in it. When that version of reality consistently presented wealthy women through a lens of simultaneous admiration and judgment, consistently emphasized their failures over their capacities, consistently treated their distress as entertainment and their private pain as public property, it was doing something with real effects on real people, not as a side effect of honest reporting, but as a feature of a product designed to generate a specific emotional response in its consumers. The emotional response it was designed to generate, that complicated mixture of fascination and judgment and vicarious experience and mild superiority, was exactly what it generated. Reliably, for decades, the women who generated it paid the cost. The readers who consumed it received the benefit. The publishers who organized the exchange made money. The asymmetry is the system, and the system is the story. We have been working through the stories within that larger story, and we have arrived at a point where the specific cases have accumulated enough weight to support the structural argument that each individual case illustrates. The childhoods, the marriages, the beauty standards, the campaigns and their hollow victories, the fortunes and their diminishment, the press and its particular form of participation, all of these are components of a single mechanism operating across the decades of the Gilded Age and into its successor period, producing the specific kinds of outcomes we have been examining. What remains is to understand what that mechanism did to the interior lives of the women it processed, not the external events, which we have now covered in considerable detail, but the psychological experience of being inside the system, of managing the gap between public and private across years and decades, of maintaining the performance that the era required while living the life that the performance was concealing. Because the previous chapters have established the external dimensions of these experiences with some thoroughness, and the external dimensions, while important, are not the whole story. The whole story includes what it actually felt like, from the inside, to be Marietta Holloway, or Caroline Fisk, or Rosalind Pemberton, or Violet Hardcastle, navigating the specific terrain that this specific era had prepared for them. And that interior dimension is where we go next, into the psychology of privilege as it actually operated in these lives, which turns out to be considerably stranger and more instructive than the simplified version that either the newspapers or the subsequent historical record tends to provide. The interior dimension of these lives, which is where we promised to go at the end of the last chapter, turns out to be the most counterintuitive part of the story. Everything we have examined so far has been, in some sense, legible. The childhood conditions produced identifiable outcomes, the marriages followed recognizable patterns, the press operated according to understandable incentives. But the psychology of what it actually felt like to be inside all of this, to be a person with extraordinary wealth and privilege and to find that the wealth and privilege were not doing the protective work they were supposed to do, requires a different kind of examination, because it defies the intuitions most people bring to it. The intuition most people bring is roughly this: if you have enough money, you can solve most problems, and if you have truly extraordinary amounts of money, the kind that the Gilded Age produced in its upper reaches, the problems you cannot solve must be the result of poor decision-making, because surely the resources are sufficient to address almost any difficulty. This intuition is wrong, in the specific and systematic way that the cases we have examined demonstrate. But it is wrong in ways that require unpacking, because the wrongness is not obvious from the outside, which is why it persisted in the era that produced these outcomes, and why it still circulates as a default assumption in most popular discussion of these lives. The first thing that extraordinary wealth does, which is counterintuitive, is restrict the information available to its possessor. This sounds wrong. It sounds exactly backwards. Wealth provides access, and access provides information, and therefore wealth should produce better information than poverty, not worse. This is true in the factual sense. A wealthy person has access to more books, more experts, more travel, more experience of the world in its variety. But the information that is most important for navigating the social and emotional dimensions of life is interpersonal, and interpersonal information available to people of very great wealth is systematically distorted in ways that make it less useful, not more. The specific distortion is this: people behave differently around money and around people who have it than they behave in its absence. They agree more readily, They contradict less directly. They tell you what you want to hear, not because they are necessarily dishonest by nature, but because the cost of telling a very wealthy person something unpleasant is higher than the cost of telling an ordinary person the same thing. Higher socially, higher financially, higher in terms of access and opportunity. The person with money is, in most social contexts, both the host and the judge, and the people around them are aware of this, whether or not they consciously acknowledge it. The result is a social environment in which genuine, unfiltered feedback is extremely rare, in which consensus forms easily around whatever position the wealthy person appears to prefer, and in which the ordinary corrective mechanisms that help people understand how they are actually coming across in the world are substantially degraded. This is not hypothetical. It is a well-documented phenomenon that operates across all levels of significant wealth, and it operated in the Gilded Age with particular intensity because the wealth disparities were so extreme and the social hierarchies so rigid that the ordinary channels through which truth gets communicated, the frank friend, the honest colleague, the uninvested observer, were simply not available in the social world these women inhabited. Everyone in their circle had something to gain from their continued approval. Everyone in their circle, therefore, had a reason to manage their communications accordingly. You can see how this would be useful at a dinner party, and somewhat catastrophic as a lifelong arrangement. The women who were most isolated by wealth were not, generally speaking, isolated in the obvious sense of being alone. They were surrounded by people. The social world of the Gilded Age elite was not designed for solitude, partly because solitude is hard to staff correctly. The isolation was more subtle. They were surrounded by people who were interacting with a constructed version of them rather than with the person herself. The household that responded to your preferences before you expressed them, because the staff had learned to anticipate what you wanted, was not providing connection. It was providing service, which is a fundamentally different transaction. The social circle that agreed with your opinions and celebrated your taste was not providing honest engagement. It was providing a mirror that reflected a flattering image, which is pleasant, but not nutritious as a steady diet. The psychological effect of living primarily inside flattering mirrors, across years and decades, is something that the Gilded Age did not have vocabulary to describe, but that its effects made visible to anyone who looked closely enough. Women who had been embedded in these conditions for long enough developed a specific kind of uncertainty, not about their social positions, which were clear, but about something more fundamental, their own perceptions. When your experience of reality is consistently mediated through people who are managing their presentations to you, and when you have no reliable access to unfiltered feedback, you lose, gradually, the ability to trust your own reading of situations. You cannot tell the difference between your actual preferences and the preferences that the people around you have subtly encouraged you to develop, because the encouragement has been so consistent and so ambient that it no longer registers as external. This is, in the language of 21st century psychology, a form of environmental gaslighting, not perpetrated by any single malicious individual, but produced collectively by an entire social system organized around the comfort of its wealthiest members, at the cost of any honest relationship between those members and reality. The Gilded Age was not trying to gaslight its richest women. It was simply organized in ways that produced this effect as a byproduct, which is, as we have established in several previous contexts, the classic structure of systemic harm. No conspiracy required, just a structure with incentives, and people following the incentives, and the cumulative result landing on whoever happened to be at the center of the arrangement. The paranoia that developed in some of these women as a result was not irrational, which is the important and counterintuitive point. It was a reasonable response to a real problem. If you cannot trust the information provided by the people around you, because you have learned that the people around you are managing their presentations to you, the logical conclusion is to extend that distrust broadly, to wonder, in any given interaction, what the other person's interest is, what they are concealing or adjusting or performing. This is not pathological suspicion. It is appropriate skepticism applied in an environment where appropriate skepticism is genuinely warranted. The problem is that appropriate skepticism, applied consistently in an environment where almost everyone you meet has a reason to be managing their presentation, becomes functionally indistinguishable from paranoia and carries the same social and psychological costs. The diagnosis and the reasonable conclusion look identical from the outside. This was, unsurprisingly, inconvenient. The isolation that presented as exclusivity is worth dwelling on specifically because it operated as an invisible force multiplier on all the other vulnerabilities these women carried. Exclusivity, the deliberate limitation of social access to a carefully managed circle, was, in the Gilded Age, a marker of status. The most select households admitted the fewest people, maintained the most stringent standards, operated behind the most effective social filters. To be genuinely exclusive was, in the era's social language, a sign of genuine importance. It was also inevitably genuinely isolating, because the mechanisms that keep out the wrong people also keep out the honest people, and the honest people are generally the more valuable ones for any human being's long-term psychological health, even if they are less useful for any particular dinner party's immediate success. Women who had lived inside these mechanisms of exclusivity for long enough found themselves in a social world that was smaller, more controlled, and less real than the world outside it. The range of human experience available inside an exclusive Gilded Age social circle was genuinely narrow, not in terms of material variety, which was extraordinary, but in terms of emotional and intellectual range. You encountered, consistently, people who had similar backgrounds, similar values, similar concerns, similar responses to the world. The friction of genuine difference, which is uncomfortable and also essential to anyone's development as a thinking, feeling human being, was largely absent. Everything agreed with everything, because everything had been selected for compatibility, and the compatibility, after enough years of it, became a kind of suffocation. A very well-appointed, exceptionally catered, beautifully decorated suffocation, but suffocation nonetheless. The women who noticed this suffocation and tried to escape it were the ones who generated the behaviours that the era found most puzzling. The ones who did not escape, and who stayed inside the suffocating environment until it had done its work thoroughly, present the most challenging cases to examine. They are the cases that involve not simply reduced fortune or social decline, but genuine psychological deterioration of a kind that the era had very limited tools to address and considerable motivation to conceal. Because mental illness in a prominent family was, in the Gilded Age, a social problem before it was a medical one, and the social problem was addressed first and most energetically, while the medical problem was managed in whatever manner minimized its visibility. The most common management strategy was removal. A family member who was showing signs of acute psychological distress was removed from the social environment and placed in a setting that was simultaneously more controlled and in most cases considerably less therapeutic. The private sanitariums that catered to wealthy patients in this period were not actively malevolent establishments. Many were run by people who genuinely believed they were helping, doing their best with the understanding of mental illness that the era's medicine provided, which was substantially less sophisticated than what came later. But the sanitarium's primary function, from the perspective of the families who used them, was containment, the placement of a distressing situation in a location where it would stop being visible. Whether the person inside the containment was receiving genuine help was secondary. The optics were primary. This was, in the most charitable possible interpretation, the era doing its best with the tools it had. In a somewhat less charitable interpretation, it was a very expensive way of not dealing with the problem. The women who ended in these establishments had usually travelled a long road to get there. The acute crisis that resulted in placement was almost always the visible surface of something that had been developing for years, invisible beneath the performance that these pages have described in such detail. The performance could sustain the accumulating weight for a remarkable period. These women were, as we have established, extraordinarily well trained in maintenance, but training has limits, and the limits were eventually reached, and when they were reached, the result, the breaking of the performance, the emergence of the interior in ways that could no longer be managed, could be dramatic enough to leave an impression in the historical record. The most extreme cases left a particular kind of impression. The woman who, at the end of a long trajectory of privilege and isolation and psychological erosion, had arrived at a place where the self that had been performing was no longer available as a coherent entity. Not gone exactly, the person was still present, but fragmented, or withdrawn, or organized around a different internal logic than the one the surrounding world recognized. The statement attributed to one such woman, that she had never existed, that she was not there, that the person everyone was looking for was not findable because she had never been real, is haunting precisely because it is not entirely wrong as a description of what the Gilded Age had done. It had, systematically and over a long period, treated the women inside it as performances rather than as people. The woman who concluded that she had therefore never been a person was drawing a logical conclusion from her own experience of what the world had required her to be. Disturbing? Yes. Irrational? Less so than it sounds. The physical deterioration that sometimes accompanied the psychological is a related but distinct dimension, and it has a specific mechanism worth examining. The Gilded Age produced, in its upper reaches, a relationship with the body that was both highly managed and deeply adversarial. The body was a social instrument, required to be beautiful, to be appropriately proportioned, to perform health and vitality regardless of the actual state of the underlying physiology. The management of this instrument was constant, detailed, and conducted under conditions of significant social pressure, involving corsets and restricted eating, and the cosmetic interventions we examined in an earlier chapter, all deployed in service of a standard that moved just enough to remain perpetually out of reach. Women who had spent decades managing their bodies, primarily as social instruments, developed relationships with food, with physical sensation, with the basic material fact of being alive in a body that were profoundly complicated. Some restricted food in ways that the era's medicine did not recognize as disordered, but that we would now identify immediately. Some developed the specific quality of physical disconnection that comes from years of treating your body's signals as inconvenient messages to be managed rather than information to be heeded. Good luck maintaining any kind of instinctive relationship with your own physical experience when the operating assumption for 40 years has been that your physical experience is secondary to how you appear. It is, as a long-term arrangement, not optimally designed for well-being. The women who gave away their money in the final stages, who distributed what remained of their fortunes to strangers, to servants, to people who crossed their paths in the reduced circumstances of their last years, were doing something that the era found puzzling and that we should find comprehensible. They were enacting, in the most concrete possible way, a truth they had arrived at after a lifetime of expensive lessons, that the money had not done what it was supposed to do, not because money is evil or because wealth is inherently corrupting, but because the specific way the Gilded Age organized wealth and the people who had it had produced, reliably, the wrong outcomes. The giving of it away was, from one perspective, an act of freedom, the first entirely voluntary disposition of a resource that had for so long disposed of them. Somewhat impractical as a financial strategy, admittedly, but by that point practical financial strategy was probably not the primary consideration. The legacies of these lives, when the lives were finally over, were as various as the lives themselves and as consistent in their pattern. The material objects dispersed in ways that say something, each of them, about the specific relationship between the object and the person who had owned it. Jewels went to museums, institutions organized around the public display of beautiful and significant things, which is, in its way, a continuation of the function the jewels had served in their owners' lifetimes, merely democratized. The stone that ended up in a national institution is now seen by millions of people annually who experience it primarily as an object of beauty and legend, which is exactly how it was experienced when a single woman owned it, except that now the experience is available to anyone who can afford the admission price, which the era that produced the stone would have found both democratic and slightly alarming. The gates of a great English country estate preserve, in their decorative stonework, the features of a woman who had wanted to be permanently inscribed in a place she had worked very hard to occupy. She achieved this form of permanence while the rest of her life was conducting a rather more thorough dissolution. The stone face remains at the gate. The person it belonged to retreated eventually from any engagement with the world that included the face. The stone does not know this. The stone does not know anything. But the people who pass through the gates and occasionally notice the carved features and wonder whose they were, they can know it, if they are interested, and the knowing is the beginning of understanding something real about the distance between being commemorated and being seen. There is, it turns out, quite a lot of distance. The woman buried with almost nothing in her account at the end of a life that had contained an almost incomprehensible amount is the clearest symbol available of what the Gilded Age did with its resources, not because she was uniquely careless, or uniquely foolish, or uniquely unfortunate, though the press would have said all three, but because the specific journey from extraordinary abundance to near absence is legible, in her case, as the product of a system rather than of individual failure. The enormous fortune, the inadequate structures, the life consumed in service of a performance that the era required and that left, in the end, almost nothing behind it except the performance itself and the stories people told about it. The stories people tell about it, which is what we've been doing across this entire examination, are the legacy that matters most. Not because stories are more real than the material objects, though in some sense they are, but because the stories are what determine whether the women who lived these lives are remembered as symbols or as people, as cautionary tales or as specific human beings navigating specific and difficult circumstances, as the poor little rich girls of their era, or as the subjects of a historical moment that was doing something systematic and identifiable to a specific category of person. It was a social arrangement that required, what do we do with all of this now that we have assembled it? The honest answer is that there is no tidy resolution available, because the story is not tidy and does not resolve. What there is instead is clarity, the ability to see, with the precision that distance and documentation provide, exactly what the structure was, exactly how it operated, and exactly who paid for its operation. The clarity does not undo the harm, but it makes the harm comprehensible rather than merely tragic, which is the difference between a cautionary tale and a lesson. A cautionary tale says, look what happened to those women who made those choices in those circumstances. A lesson says, look what a specific arrangement of power and expectation produces reliably when it operates on a specific category of person, and ask what arrangements we are currently operating that might be doing something similar. The question is uncomfortable. It is supposed to be. The Gilded Age was not comfortable for the people at the centre of it, and the examination of it should not be entirely comfortable for the people examining it. Discomfort in this context is information. It is the signal that the lesson is landing rather than merely being received. And on that note, after all of this, after the marble floors and the flattering mirrors and the gates with the stone faces and the accounts with the embarrassingly small balances, here, finally, is where this particular journey through the gilded wreckage of other people's lives comes to an end. These women deserved more than the era gave them. Their stories deserved more than the simplified versions that history has mostly preserved. And whoever you are, wherever you are in the world right now, you deserve a good night's sleep, which is a considerably simpler and more reliably achievable thing than anything the Gilded Age was offering anyone. Good night and sweet dreams. But before we entirely close the door on this era, there is one more dimension of the psychological experience worth examining, because it is the one most frequently misunderstood when people encounter these stories, with the benefit of modern hindsight, the question of agency. The temptation, when examining lives that went as wrong as these did in as many ways, is to conclude that the women involved were passive, that they were acted upon by forces they could not control, and were essentially helpless within the systems that contained them. This is incorrect, and the incorrectness matters because it is patronizing in a way that the women themselves would have found deeply objectionable, and also because it is empirically inaccurate. The agency was real. The constraints on the agency were also real. Both things are true simultaneously, and the difficulty of holding both things true at once is part of what makes these lives hard to understand through the simplified frameworks that history usually provides. We want to either exonerate the women entirely, blame the system, absolve the individual, or to hold them responsible for their outcomes in ways that ignore the structural conditions that shape their choices. Neither framework is adequate. The adequate framework requires holding both the agency and the constraint in view at the same time, which is uncomfortable but accurate. The specific texture of constrained agency, making real choices within conditions you did not choose, is what gives these lives their particular poignancy. These were not people to whom things simply happened. They were people who were actively trying, in the ways available to them, to make their lives something they could recognize as their own. Sylvia's campaign was an exercise of agency as complete as the era permitted. Rosalind's confidence was an assertion of self against circumstances that tried to define her. Violet's marriages, however disastrously they resolved, were each an attempt to find something the world had not yet provided, an attempt that the era's conditions made almost guaranteed to fail, but an attempt nonetheless. The failure to find what they were looking for does not mean they were not looking, or that the looking was wrong, or that the thing they were looking for was not real and worth looking for. It means that the available paths to it were blocked by structures that the women in question had not built and could not dismantle. Structures that had been built before they arrived, and that would remain after they left, slightly modified by the pressure these lives had applied to them, but fundamentally intact. The fundamental intactness of the structure is, in its way, the most sobering conclusion available from all of this examination. The Gilded Age is over. The specific social arrangements it produced, the transatlantic marriages, the sanitarium as primary mental health intervention, the corset as structural requirement, have been replaced by different arrangements. But the underlying questions the Gilded Age surfaces: what do we owe to the people inside our systems? What happens when identity is built entirely on externally controlled circumstances? What the psychology of sustained performance does to the person performing it? These questions have not been resolved. They have been relocated. The specific forms have changed. The essential issues are recognizable. This is why the women of the Gilded Age remain interesting to us over a century after the era that produced them ended. Not because of the jewels, though the jewels are impressive. Not because of the scandals, though the scandals are dramatic. But because their experiences illuminate something that remains true and remains consequential about the relationship between human beings and the social structures they inhabit, about what those structures can do to people when they're organized around the wrong priorities, and about what people can do within those structures when the structures are not organized for their benefit. The women we have examined did not solve these problems. They could not. They lived inside the problems, and they managed them with varying degrees of success, and they left behind them a record of the managing that is, if we are willing to read it carefully, still instructive. That is the legacy that matters, more than the jewels in the museum, more than the stone face at the gate, more than the account balance that reads like an ironic conclusion to a story that began with tens of millions. The legacy is the record, and the record, read with the attention it deserves, says something real about what it costs to live in a world organized around the wrong things, and what it looks like when very capable people try, and mostly fail, to build something genuine inside it. We have been reading that record for some time now, and the reading has been, as these things tend to be when they are done honestly, both illuminating and sobering. The illumination is the understanding of the mechanism. The sobering part is the recognition that the mechanism, in modified forms, continues to operate. The specific targets have changed. The specific forms of constraint have evolved. The press has been amplified far beyond what the Gilded Age could have imagined. The expectations around appearance have shifted in their specific content, while remaining extraordinarily intense in their application. The marriage market has been modified without being eliminated. The emotional conditions that produce certain kinds of psychological outcomes have been somewhat better understood without being reliably prevented. The women of the Gilded Age were not uniquely unfortunate. They were specifically unfortunate in the ways that a specific historical moment is capable of producing, with the tools that moment had available and the blindnesses that moment maintained. The understanding of what was done to them is the best tribute available to their actual experience, better than the museum placards, better than the occasional historical biography, better than the myth of the cursed jewel. Understanding is what turns a cautionary tale into a lesson, and a lesson into something that might eventually produce a different outcome. That different outcome is not guaranteed. History, as anyone who has spent time with it will confirm, is not particularly reliable about learning from itself in any efficient time frame, but the possibility of it exists, and the existence of the possibility is something. Possibly the thing that the whole long examination has been aimed at producing. Not comfort, not resolution, not the satisfying closure of a narrative that wraps neatly at its conclusion, but the possibility of a different outcome, held open by the understanding of what produced the outcomes we have examined. The women who lived these lives deserved more than the era gave them. Their stories deserve more than the simplified versions that history has mostly preserved. What they deserve, and what this telling has tried to provide, is the most useful thing available to the dead from the living, the honest accounting. The accounting that says, here is what happened, here is why it happened, here is the mechanism, here is the cost, and here is what the mechanism looked like from inside the life it was processing. That accounting is now as complete as this particular examination is able to make it, and so, with the last thread of the Gilded Age properly traced, and the psychological portrait of its most celebrated and most damaged women assembled, with as much honesty as the available record permits, and the legacy of all this, the jewels, the gates, the accounts, the archives, properly considered, it is time to let these women rest. not in the simplified versions of themselves that the era produced and history repeated, but as they actually were, complicated, capable, shaped by forces they did not entirely choose, trying in the ways available to them to make something real inside systems that were not particularly organized for their benefit. They tried. The trying was real. And tonight, wherever you are in the world, having spent this time with their stories, good night and genuinely sweet dreams.